What's up, folks? This is Addy Ads. This is Public Intelligence and the Epstein Files. Great guest on the show today, Professor Thomas Volscho, who I actually met recently at the Jurgate hearing. And to the best of my knowledge, he covered the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, and he's been covering this case for quite some time now. And as far as I know, he's a professor of sociology and criminology, and we're gonna get into that today. And I want to welcome you on the show, sir. And then if you could just beef up your introduction for those that aren't familiar with your work, which I found interesting. We had mutual kind of acquaintances or colleagues before meeting each other in person, so I thought that was pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you for having me on your show. This is really cool. I don't think I've ever done a live stream before, so this is very cool.
Oh, excellent! That's awesome.
Yeah, this is really
Sweet.
cool. Um, I'm a professor of sociology at the City University of New York at the College of Staten Island. I've been there since 2009. I grew up in Connecticut originally, in the central Connecticut, and then moved down to Staten Island when I got the job. And as a sociologist, I've studied income inequality, and I used a lot of statistical modeling to do it. And I did this paper on the super rich in 2012 that got cited a lot in the literature. Um, and So I spent a lot of time, and then I've done some other research on sterilization of non-white women as a means of population control. Um, and I've published some of that research in a Native American Studies journal that's run out of the University of New Mexico. Um, and with regard to Epstein, basically we started a criminology program in our sociology department a couple years ago. And criminology was not something that I was ever in graduate school. I never really got too far into it. Um, but I knew of the Epstein case, and I happened to be working on a case of public corruption in New Jersey in my kids' school district, where my kids go to school. I found that the superintendent was basically he had conned his way into the job, and so
Really?
myself and yeah, it was pretty amazing to see that this person in a high trusted position of authority is basically lied on all his resumes to get the job. Like he concealed certain jobs. We found that he had a DUI where he was chased by the police, and he never
Wow.
disclosed it on his application and everything. And he was doing all this corrupt stuff, hiring friends, giving out contracts to people, covering up. Our secretary of my kid's school appears to have stolen from the field trip money to pay her property taxes on her house. And it was she did it all electronically, so I was able to dig up every piece of documentation on it. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it was
Wow.
pretty crazy. And so I developed all these techniques of I really learned a lot about using open public records and FOIA to do that work. And this Epstein thing was percolating in my mind for many years, because I used to show when I would teach social inequality. I would show the sex offender registry, and we discussed why do people wind up on the sex offender registry and things like that. And I'm like, here, students, look at this. This guy is he's unlike anyone else on the sex offender registry. And it would show he had all this Cadillac Escalades, airplanes, a Boeing 727, all these properties dispersed throughout the world. Um, and I would discuss some of the court. I dug up all these court documents from the Brad Edwards cases. So I've
Hmm.
had those for a long time. I was looking at those, and there was an underground independent journalist who were covering this for a few years. Ed Opperman is one of them, and Ed Opperman actually he's a private
Yeah.
investigator, and he had what was it, a podcast, and he
Yeah.
would talk about the case. He was talking about it for a few years before Epstein got arrested. I originally heard of Epstein getting arrested when he got arrested, because it's a strange story, but my first daughter wouldn't sleep at night, and I used to have to sit there and hold her. So I would pull out my laptop and I'd read random news stories, and I was like, oh my god, some guy from Wall Street got in trouble for what we know they must be doing down there, that that there's probably wealthy men. And yeah, so I had kind of knew of the case, and then I remember it blew up in the Daily Mail when Virginia Roberts' picture with Prince Andrew hit the
Mm.
newsstands. It was like 2011, and then again in 2015 once she sued Ghislaine Maxwell in civil court. So I've been kind of following it, and then I kind of after the superintendent thing went down, I got like I got real. I was like, okay, now I have time to do this project. I have like one other smaller project, but I can really focus on this. Um, and I started talking to source. I started finding out, I was like, oh, this Epstein, some of his story doesn't add up. And I was able to get like the Dalton School to give me a copy of their newspaper. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, the Dalton School accidentally left. This is before Epstein got arrested in 2019. They accidentally left like their digital searchable archive online, and so I was able to figure out like what page of the yearbook Epstein was on, and all these different pages of the school newspaper called the Daltonian where he was mentioned. And
Wow.
so I got the librarian to give it to me. And I said, "Oh, I'm kind of, I was a little deceptive. I was like, oh, I'm kind of interested in the math team." And Epstein was the coach of the math team. I could read the text, so I got the original copy of the newspaper, and in one of the pieces mentioning Epstein, it's just like buried in the text somewhere. It said that like this one woman is a new math teacher who's joining us, and this other man, Mr. Epstein, will be joining us to teach math and physics. And I'm looking at the newspapers from 1974, but if you read all the reporting, it said that Epstein started teaching at Dalton School in 73. So, but the reality was that he started in August or September of 74 when their semester started. Um, and Bill Barr had actually left by the time Epstein started working. However, Barr probably hired him because Barr would hire people usually like in February or March. So he probably hired him in February or March of 74, but Barr was kind of chased out by the board of trustees, and the students wanted to wear, like the men wanted to wear long hair, because remember this is the 1970s, and like bell bottoms and counterculture type stuff, even wealthy kids. And Barr did not like that. Barr was very Donald Barr. We're talking here. He's the
Yeah.
father of William Barr, who was Trump's attorney general, who just wrote a book. I'm
Yeah.
rambling on, but that's kind of how I got into it. And I one
H.W.
of my
Bush's too.
in the bushes, yeah. So he's
Mm.
been like connected. He's been like a power player for like many administrations and decades. Um, but I had sources telling me. I started talking to a couple of reporters, and there was this one particular source that I never knew how much to trust him, but I kind of liked him. He was a fun person to talk to, and his name was Stephen Hoffenberg, and he actually tipped me off that Epstein was going to get arrested. Um, and he was like, he thought it was going to happen in June, and maybe the authorities planned to do it in June, but their first opportunity was when Epstein flew from France to Teterboro Airport, and that's when they kept it so top secret because Epstein had a way of like figuring out what was going to happen next. So I've been rambling, but
No, this is great. Before we get deeper into Epstein, I actually had a couple questions about some of your earlier work. What was that most cited paper that you had, or really highly cited paper? What was the topic of that?
it was called The Rise of the Super Rich, and it was basically like a statistical model of the top 1%. So there's this two economists, Piketty and Saez, and they had been writing about how if we look at economic inequality in the U.S., the government official statistics were they deflated how bad it was. They made the rich look less rich. So they took this old IRS data that went back to 1913 when the income tax started, and they created these measures. So what we did, I teamed up with a political scientist from the University of Tennessee, and what we did was we modeled like the fraction of all income going to the richest 1%. And it's not like mind blowing, and it's probably like reading Greek for a lot of people if you go through it. It's a technical paper, but yeah, we showed that like the stock market and the housing bubble made people really rich after you account for like globalization and the dropping tax rates on the on the super rich. So
Okay, okay, and the other one was was that what you meant then by income inequality? That was what you were focused on at that time?
Yeah, yeah, that was one of the ones. And it's very like abstract and arcane to a lot of people, but it's like, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. We tried to figure out why, like why and how did that happen?
Did you come to a conclusion why?
Yeah, it turns out that there's like multiple things going on. I didn't mention it a minute ago, but like the declining share of Americans that are a part of a labor union had a big effect. I mean, it made rich people a lot richer.
Okay.
Um, so it was like dropping tax rates on the rich, getting rid of unions, increasing global trade. Um, and
Really?
then the stock and housing markets, yeah, because those were
Okay.
bubbles. When they
Yeah.
become bubbles, rich people, which is
Right.
an inflation, it's actually a form of
Yeah.
inflation, but it's an inflation for the stock and housing market, and the mortgage-backed securities, of course, then pop up because of that, and rich people get really rich off of just nothing and expectations, and then when the bull bursts, that's when the average person loses their shirt because the wealthy people are better informed and they know when the economic crisis is going to happen, so they almost always sell their stock before the stock market goes off the cliff, and it's like the middle class and the 401k holders that are like, my retirement account has just plummeted in value, what do I do?
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Okay. Excellent. And what did you conclude about the sterilization study you did, or the? Yeah. Do you want to talk about
Yeah,
that a little more in depth?
sure. So back when I was in grad school, my wife recommended this film. It was about Puerto Rico. It was called La Operacion, or The Operation. It was about like the U.S. encouraged the sterilization of Puerto Rican women, meaning like it encouraged them to come in and get sterilized. It tricked women. And sterilization, in that sense, it was a surgical procedure where you basically cut and tie the fallopian tubes together. Um, and the idea was population control, and that the United States didn't want like another Cuban revolution, so they decided to like encourage like Puerto Ricans to move to like New York and Florida. And for those that didn't, of course, they would sterilize women in order to like drop the population on the island, to prevent like social pressures and possible like revolution of some kind. Um, and then, when you go through the history of this, there's a book called Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, who's a legal scholar. And if you like, she sets it up that like if you under slavery, black women couldn't have enough children because slave owners, that was their property, and they were working for free for them. And so the more babies a black woman had that they owned, the richer they got. After the Civil War, um, when black Americans maybe start getting the right to vote, then there's like this reversal that, oh, there's too many black people, let's sterilize black women, let's stop them from having babies. And so like there was a lot of like under slavery, black women would be kidnapped and experimented on. I'm sorry, after slavery, even black women would be experimented on for surgical procedures like that, that had never been done before. So it was black women, depending on which historical period you're talking, um, Native American women depopulating Native Americans to steal land. The government wanted the land and then to give the land to private interests. And for Puerto Ricans at that time, it was about population control on the island. I mean, I actually interviewed a doctor. He was doing his residency. He's maybe in his 80s now, but back in the 1970s, he was doing his residency at Los Angeles County Medical Center. And when he was, he's basically like a student. He has his degree and he's learning how to be a doctor. They were taking a tour of Los Angeles County Medical Center, and he's like, "Wow, the maternity ward is so much nicer than like the rest of the hospital." And this old white doctor, without blinking an eye, says, "We got a grant from the federal government to see how fast we can cut the Negro and Mexican population." So that was like, that kind of tells you a lot. So what I did was I did a more modern study with statistical data, high tech statistics. And you can show that even like in as recently as the 2000s, there's still this higher rate of sterilization after you adjust for like confounding factors among samples of Americans, especially African American women, American Indian or Native American women, and to some extent, like women with Mexican ancestry live in the United States, that they're more likely to have been sterilized, and they're more likely to have gotten like Depo-Provera shots, or to have used what's not no longer in use now, but something called Norplant, which was like a they would surgically implant it into a woman's shoulder, and it would slowly release levonorgestrel, which is basically it would sterilize you for like 5 years. And they would force women on like welfare to like judges were actually sentencing women to like have these metal rods implanted in their arms. Just pretty disturbing. It's very much like Nazi Germany, and if you look at the history, actually American eugenics and like population control, like controlling women's reproduction to stop like certain undesirable groups from reproducing. Hitler studied this, and it actually informed like Hitler's program in Germany, which is it's kind of mind blowing to a lot of people. But that's the way that that he looked at the world, and he did study the U.S.
Wow. So he learned from the United States in terms of his understanding implementation of eugenics. And
Mhm.
you mentioned about what the I can't remember what the context was. The guy saying he got government money to get rid of or to implement uh, that sort of treatment against Mexicans and blacks. You said?
Yes. I think it was it was an old, it used to be called Health, Education, and Welfare was the name of our government bureaucracy. I think it's now called
Uh,
Health and Human Services.
yeah.
um, but that was they would like put out these grants um, to like medical centers in poor neighborhoods with lots of people of color who are poor, and like encourage the doctors to sterilize them. And even there was even a doctor, I think, from Puerto Rico, who was then working at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, and saying like, I'm really good at these tubal sterilizations, that's all I do, and like I'll show you all your doctors how to do it. And they did it at Hartford, Connecticut, I know too. But it was a health, education, and welfare. And not only that, but like they funded like these different high-tech birth control initiatives like Norplant and quinacrine, or at least the use of quinacrine. Some of these things actually, I think like Depo-Provera, in certain contexts, it's been actually like recommended for like pedophiles. They call it chemical castration, where if they give a male the shot, that it'll make them not interested in sex. Kind of interesting.
Oh, okay. So it gets rid of one's libido and or chemically gets rid of that, right?
Yeah, I guess in a male. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Wow. That's ridiculous findings there, Professor. Why do you think that is? Is it? Yeah. Why do you think that is?
The chemistry of it, or
I'm sorry. Why do you think that sort of directive against blacks and natives and Mexican women is, or is that on purpose, or why do you think that's happening? Or yeah, what's going on there?
yeah, I think I mean I assume it's on purpose, because it seems to be like, well, you can find written documents in certain archives of people that say that you really need to do this because we need to like whiten the country. And Native Americans, after that there's an obvious thing there with forced removal. Then you get into questions of like when they put these certain Native Americans on reservations, it was later discovered that the reservations are sitting on like oil and copper. And now it's like if we can drop the population like legally below a certain threshold, then the federal government, if there's less than like, man, it's like 1,000 people, then it's no longer a federally recognized tribe, and maybe your land rights revert back to the government.
Sure. So there's a economic real estate drive for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably. Yeah, very likely.
Okay. Okay. Wow. And as far as Epstein, you mentioned uh, what was the hook point for you, if you remember, the very first time you heard his name, or maybe it was Maxwell's name you heard first. I don't know.
It was actually Epstein. My first, like, really what I got into, I was like, wow, this is a case, I thought, well, I still think, of public corruption. This is where like the federal government, um, who's supposed to protect its citizens, in this case, in Epstein's case, it's young, vulnerable girls who were victimized, um, and prevent a predator from continuing to prey on future victims. And instead of doing that, they gave him a sentence where this whole sentence was like rigged, where they counted, like, I think a girl who was close to the age of consent winds up being the one victim because he's he pleads guilty to a, a count of solicitation of one minor for prostitution, um, and soliciting for prostitution. Um, and so that instead of choosing, like, the first victim who walked in was 14, but they wind up, the grand jury in Florida decides to use a 17-year-old. And then when you saw, like, the sentences, obviously scandalous, where Epstein is required to report to the county jail. He's given his own wing. The door is left open at night. They put a new television in the attorney room for him. He's always he gets. I have, like, records. He gets caught with, like, what's considered contraband, which is basically like he had extra stuff that he wasn't supposed to. All the, like, red carpet is thrown out, and then he gets work release. And sex offenders in Florida, generally child sex offenders, do not get work release. So the whole thing just sounded bizarre, coupled with the fact that he's friends with former presidents and presidents to be at the time. The world's economic elite, the owner of Victoria's Secret, of a highly regarded Midwestern billionaire, and then all these celebrities and royalty are around this guy. So there's this obvious, like, okay, there's got to be some kind of corruption going on in there to yield such a sentence.
Yeah, definitely. And what was what were your references for, or resources for, when you were researching this? Because as you mentioned, there were independent writers and journalists looking into this for years before it broke in the mainstream.
Right. So, like, some of the independent people that I was reading at the time. So, like, Ed Opperman had a nice show. I think this guy named Pierce Redmond, he was very familiar with a lot of the court documents. Oh, what was her name? Um, Conchita Sarnoff she wrote a bunch of articles for, like, the Daily Beast, and then she
Hmm.
came out with a book right around the time James Patterson was coming out with a book. And um, Sarnoff's book was really well done. It was very close to the court records. It was very accurate. And she interviewed victim number one. She gave her a cute, the way that she did the pseudonym was very interesting. Um, she named her after Spice. But like, she had a very good grasp, and she has this really strange story. Like, she knew Epstein. She had met Maxwell before on the because she's from, like, an elite background, and she got into sex trafficking because I think she met some little girl from Mexico who turned out to be trafficked, and she actually went into Mexico, and I forget which region of Mexico, but she was, like, as a journalist, was trying to trace, like, where this girl came from, whether there was, like, a foster home that was sort of involved in trafficking. And she claims that, like, her life was threatened, and she had to actually leave Mexico because there was, like, a trafficking cartel was like, you're asking too many questions, and she felt as if her life was in danger. So when she came back to the US, she'd heard that, like, Epstein, who she had met Epstein before, and that he had gotten arrested. Um, and I know that one time when, she, according to her recollection, I believe it was that Epstein saw a picture of her, that her friend had a picture, and her friend was flying on Epstein's jet or something, and said, "I want to meet this woman here," and he's pointing at the picture. So she met him, and she was kind of like, "Yeah, not like really, somebody I really want to hang out with." But then one day Epstein shows up at her house, and, like, her 9-year-old daughter answered the door, and her daughter apparently was freaked out by Epstein and ran to, like, hugging her mother. And she's like, "My daughter's, like, never acts like this." So I don't know if that was a certain, like, canary in the coal mine type of thing of what was to come. But my sources were, a lot of it was looking at old court records, especially in Florida. Florida has very good. Florida, it's a strange state, right? It's like, has this reputation for, like, corruption, so as does the state I'm in, New Jersey, but they have really good open public records laws. At least I'd say Florida is, like, one of the best for, like, open public records. I mean, I've gotten so many records from Florida, even the state attorney's office finally relented and released like all the Epstein files that they had. A lot of it, a lot of bandwidth, which is taken up by these MySpace pages that I think Alan Dershowitz basically gave to the prosecutors to try to denigrate all of Epstein's victims. Um, but my sources were a lot of those Florida court records, and then attorneys for the victims would send me. I would ask, oh, could I get a transcript of a deposition? And so a lot of it is like if you foster like a nice relationship with defend the like attorneys that represent victims, once you start to figure out like from the court records, you can see like who the attorney is, and then start asking if you can see certain records that they don't have in the public court files. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's a good tactic there, for sure. And do you use these principally in your work as a professor, or do you also? Because I know you actually won an award, I believe, for journalism, didn't you?
yeah, it's kind of a weird thing. Like the university presented it as if I won it, but I guess I worked on a program and the program won it, and it was this like ABC News podcast on Jeffrey Epstein that it won it for like investigative journalism. Because I think we did a good job. I got to work with some like really hardcore producers that are like extremely, um, yeah. There's the university decided to say that I won it, but I think it's more accurate for them to say that uh, the program that I worked on won it. But then I guess it sounds too I don't know how they. I'm not a professional journalist, so I don't know how if I've like if they've offended someone. But that's basically what we did. We did this podcast. And it was like I was going around talking to people, and they really tasked me with trying to figure out like where did Epstein's money come from, um,
That's a great question.
which I think I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on it. I'm just waiting from my co-author to get the draft of our article out, but we have it pretty well. I mean, I tracked down a lot of his assets that I could find on paper through old legal documents. So like I have a Swiss bank statement of Jeffrey Epstein's from 19 December 1988. That was the date of it. And he
Wow.
basically gave that to the landlord of the 457 Madison, which was the Villard house where he on the
Yeah.
fourth floor, he rented the whole floor. And he kept his offices there. The year before he rented it, he was actually subletting it while he was working as part of a Ponzi scheme. He had actually been a subletter there, and then once he hit pay dirt, which is Leslie Wexner, that's when he got the entire fourth floor. And but Epstein's money, it's got like different phases to it. So he grew his father actually did work for the New York City Parks Department. Um, there were like two parks in Brooklyn, according to one of his childhood friends. But I did in the New York City Municipal Archives, and it wasn't fun to do this, but I did find. Oh, that's cool. You went out to 457 Madison and got some good shots there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. Yeah. Just because you mentioned it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and then like right across the street, there's like some fancy dining, and I think he would have them cater the like some of his some of his flights on his big jet. And then he would have like his secretaries could go to this expensive hairdresser across the street. But Epstein's father did, he did grow up with a father who made like in today's money about $50,000 a year, and imagine living on $50,000 a year with a family of two kids and a spouse who doesn't work, and you're living in Brooklyn. I mean, that's like hard to live in Brooklyn on that money nowadays. Though
Yeah.
you can do it. Um, but uh, so his father worked for the Parks Department as a groundskeeper and like sweeping up stuff. And I think he first started working there as part of like like a jobs program that the city was doing to like alleviate some unemployment. But I was able to find his father's listing, which gives like his name, his address, and his salary. It's called the civil list. And so like the city of New York has something called the civil list, and it's everybody who works for the city in a given year. And I think like police officers, they don't put their names because they, like I guess they're worried that like somebody might come and mess with them. But I think that's a common tactic in a lot of places, not to really publicize the names of the police, but at the same time, could be malfeasance for there's all kinds of reasons, but if you're busting people, I guess you don't want people to know your name and address so they can come over and bust you, I guess. But anyway, the average employee is on the list, and Epstein's father, Seymour G. Epstein, is listed, that he works for the Parks Department, and his salary in today's money, when we adjusted it for inflation, it was, and I'm sure he got like overtime because he was paid by the hour, but it would give like his annual earnings each year. Now I went back to the early 70s. When you go like further back in time than that, even the municipal archivist is like, I do not understand, because it's all on microfiche. I didn't either. I tried. I gave it a couple hours, but I was like, I can't go any earlier than, I think it was like 1969. I have to look at my records. I have it, for my book. I have it all spelled out. But that's where his father worked. When Epstein, at the time, got his first job, which was that we know of. It wasn't actually his first job. Like, he had like little part-time jobs, like driving taxi cabs. I think he worked for a roofer on Atlantic Avenue for like a summer. He At one point he went out to California, and he was kind of like bouncing around in the Berkeley area. And I think he was hanging around with scientists that worked for the, I think it was called the Lawrence Livermore, I think they're called the Berkeley Radiation Lab at the time. This is the Cold War, right? And Epstein really, he kind of liked scientists, but there was something about science, being a scientist, that he didn't like. And what that was that scientists have no money. You're like a professor, you have, you make a living. It depends what school and everything that you teach at, and whether or not you're an adjunct or a full-time professor. And you don't, you might, he would hear that like they're always complaining about money, and they don't have enough money to go on vacation and stuff like that. But he would hang around with scientists. He was very good at math. Like, he could get through upper level undergraduate calculus courses, and he did. And so,
like what, Calc 2 or Calc 3?
Probably Calc 3. And then if you could do that, you can probably, it's not, if you can master that, teaching high school, you can probably do.
Sure. Yeah.
So basically in the early 70s, he's bouncing around. I'm pretty sure he was bouncing around California, because he knew of the name of this bookstore that's on a particular street in Berkeley, or it used to be, and it was called Cody's Bookstore, and it was on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. And what Epstein was, he would hang out there because he was an autodidact. He would read books all the time. He always had reading glasses. Like, all his assistants would have to go out and buy him reading glasses all the time, because he was sort of like a nerd. He liked to read and learn lots of stuff. And so he was there at the bookstore, according to him, flipping through this book that he came across. It was called like the nation's top wealthiest private schools in the country. And he was flipping through it, and he saw Dalton in Manhattan, and he said, "Oh, wow, minimum voluntary contribution. That's an interesting idea." And he came back from the West Coast at some point and created a fake resume that said that he graduated from, that he did an undergrad math degree at Berkeley, and that he did graduate study in mathematics at Stanford University, and applied for the job at Dalton. So that was his first job. And at his first job, he was making as much money as his father at that point. So that was 1974. If you look at Seymour Epstein's 1974 pay stub or earnings for that year from the city, he's making just as much as his son. So his son already had, a job pretty quick where he's making as much as his father, and his, father's almost at the end of his working life, where you make I think you roughly make the most money.
Right.
So that's where that Epstein basically tricked Barr into thinking he was like a math genius from like two Ivy League schools, that he got degrees at Ivy League schools. And that's why Dalton hired him. Dalton wouldn't have hired a Cooper Union dropout. Cooper Union's a very good school. Epstein got into there because Epstein was very smart, And Cooper Union, because his dad made such little money, Cooper Union would make sense because that's a full. It's every student gets their full tuition paid if they can get in to Cooper Union. Um,
Really?
yeah, Cooper Union. It's a very
Wow.
good school. It's like it was designed so like that the poor immigrants can have a shot at like a good education if they're worthy. If you mean if they're smart enough to like get in. Um, and he got in. His brother also went to Cooper Union. His brother did graduate from Cooper Union, and his brother went back to be on the board of trustees and tried imposing a tuition, which the students were not happy about, and they threw him out.
Yeah, that was in 2015, I believe.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I think he was like the president of the board of trustees. Mark Epstein, we're talking here.
The chairman, I think. I was there as well. In is like Cooper Square, whatever it's called.
Yeah, it's like that old like
There.
Peter Cooper, that guy that like has a lot of stuff named after him.
Yeah, yeah. Um, wow. So that's great stuff there, Professor. I want to keep going. Just a couple comments here. Kristen said that's going to be a very popular article. Monk Snack said this is a great interview. Is this guy on YouTube? I can't find him.
I think I made
You-
some guitar videos one time, but no, I don't. I think I don't have a YouTube channel because I don't really like do like I'm not like a social media broadcaster. Is that like the term? I
Sure.
don't have time to do it. But like I've been interviewed in some documentaries and stuff like that. But maybe I'll get more into it when the book. Because I'm working on a book on this. That's why I know so much. But
Excellent,
yeah,
excellent.
it
And
all makes the guy makes sense. Like when you start to piece everything together, Epstein becomes like less of a mystery. Um, but he still has a lot of mystery to him. I don't want to take away from that.
you find him intriguing.
He is kind of an intriguing person. He's kind of like a he was kind of like a goofy uh, guy from Coney Island at some level when he wasn't like
Mm,
if you're not a teenage girl and he's not abusing you, but even like before the abuse, he's like if you speak to victims, survivors, that they'll tell you that he was kind of like he was charming, he was kind of funny sometimes, and it's and a lot of times like when someone tells you that they're like embarrassed to tell you that, but it's
I've
okay.
noticed that.
Almost all child molesters and sexual deviants, that people that abuse people, they almost all are charming and likable. That's why they get away with like people that abuse a lot of people. It's usually because they're likable, they're a pillar of the community. So
Yeah, yeah,
victims don't have anything to be ashamed about, that the person was nice.
sure, sure. I just wanted hearing it from people who tell me they were victims of him. I want to see it. I wanted to see it in person, like see it in action. It's like persuade me or like seduce me type of thing. Like I want to see the charm in action with my own two eyes. You know what I'm saying?
Right, like video footage of the guy is it's tough to come by, but like everybody was seduced by this guy. He could like even like his probably most formidable enemy was probably Brad Edwards, and even Brad Edwards said sometimes I had to fight myself not to like this guy because he was extremely likable. He put people like he put made people put their guard down. um
Wow.
But he's not alone, though. There's tons of people like this. I mean, there's Catholic priests that that people trust them. They trust their kids with them, and that's Boy Scout leaders. Like they a lot of times the molesters, they gravitate towards those jobs where they're going to have access to victims. And it's
Right.
usually very likable people. And then the thing about the being the likable person is that the victims, like no one's ever going to believe me because everybody loves him and they haven't seen this side of the person.
Do you want to talk more about your book? Who your co-author is, title, or release date? If you have any of that information. Or
Sure. So the book is mine. I'm the only author of the book, but the article is with Roddy Boyd, who's a longtime investigative financial journalist, and he had worked in the past for like I think the New York Post, maybe New Yorker or Fortune. I don't have his resume memorized, but he's a very good. I think the New York Times tried recruiting him, but instead he created this like nonprofit foundation to study financial frauds. Um, and so Epstein actually fits in pretty well because Epstein was a bit of a
Right.
fraud.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's like an article on Epstein's like economic life. My book that I'm writing is it's more tailored for like criminology, psychology, and sociology classes. But it's I think like people that aren't taking a class would probably think it's kind of there's some interesting stuff in there. Um, and it's a study of Jeffrey Epstein as a predator and all the calculations that predators make. So there's a theory in criminology and sociology called the rational choice theory of crime, where you look at like the decision making processes of criminals and what they do before, during, and after their crimes, all the premeditation that goes into it. And so there's actually a rational choice theory of child molesters, how child molesters make strategic decisions to like, get near children, to gain people's trust, to put the parents at ease. All grooming is almost all like can be conceptualized as rational choice behavior, where they basically are trying to maximize the benefit and minimize the cost, right? So they're trying to like, so a child molester is trying to get sexual and psychological gratification from abusing people. At the same time, they're trying to minimize the likelihood that they get caught. So they have to make all these strategic decisions in order to carry out their crimes. And in Epstein's case, it's like creating this big corporation, actually using shell companies, which are corporations, to create like industrial scale recruiting and abusing um, apparatus. So the book talks about that. I talk about like what they call it's in the literature, how child molesters have to manage their spoiled identity, meaning like when they get sort of like found out. So there's like these two big things that happen. I talked about it earlier, the Daily Mail articles with Virginia Roberts. That's when like Epstein and Maxwell suddenly change a lot of their behaviors when those stories hit the press. Maxwell tries to fight back at Virginia Roberts and winds up getting sued for libel and defamation, which actually sets like the pathway towards Epstein's arrest, because all the evidence that shows up in that Giuffre versus Maxwell case. I mean, that's a treasure trove of like the evidence that Epstein was having. Had a big sex trafficking operation, that Maxwell was involved, that other rich men were involved.
Huge blunder by Ghislaine Maxwell, you'd say.
Yeah, that's. I mean, if she like would have just settled quietly and not the amount of time she spent fighting that dredged up so much discovery and evidence. If she would have just like, Jeffrey, could you just pay her, whatever they want to settle
Mhm.
for real quick, it would have went away. And I don't know if we'd be talking about Maxwell or if we'd be attending her trial, or
Yeah.
if Epstein would have gotten arrested for New York based crimes.
Sure, sure, yeah. What surprised you most about Jeffrey Epstein that you learned in your research so far?
That's a really good question. Because when you look at Epstein, it's like every day there's a new surprise. So it's kind of like it was like nonstop surprises, and
Yeah.
it was a matter of like, what was the biggest surprise? I guess like he went to Russia in the '90s. His pictures. I interviewed somebody who was with him when he went to Russia. He went into a school classroom in Russia. Of course, he has to go check out the schools. He would tell everybody he was a teacher at heart. Um, he was engaged to be married in the '70s. I guess nobody really knows about that.
To whom?
His this girl he had known since middle school, and
Hmm.
as a 14-year-old, she looks a lot like his victims. And
There you
I think
go.
he paid for her son's private school as an adult, and she wrote or allegedly wrote like a character reference paragraph that his attorney used in
Did
a letter.
she did she have her kid? His kid?
No, I don't think so.
No.
I believe it's her, the man that
Someone
she used to
else?
be married to. Yeah,
Okay.
but um,
Wow.
Epstein was, yeah, Epstein,
If
like he'd known her
you're
since.
you're pretty sure that happened.
Oh yeah,
professor?
we there was a marriage license.
Wow.
I don't know if they got married, but they filed for the license, which means they went down to um, court in Manhattan and got the license and provided their birth certificates
You
to
are
get the
blowing
license.
my mind in this conversation, sir. Wow. That is so that just wow. I did not expect that from him, to be honest. But
Yeah, I think he was against it, like going forward after that. I think like I think like
oh, really?
yeah, for himself, he was really against it.
Sure, sure.
But
Yeah.
for other people, he would help them with their prenuptial agreements. He was very like he knew everything about that type of stuff. But yeah, he was in yeah, and, like I mean that there was a guy um who didn't live in so Epstein lived in the gated community called Seagate, and sometimes other kids would come into Seagate to like visit friends. And this one guy told me they had really good basketball courts, and he used to come in and they'd play basketball, and Epstein and his friend would always give him these like looks like they're idiots wasting their time by playing basketball. And but this guy had like a nearly beat the shit out of Epstein one time because it was over this woman that Epstein was engaged to because they both dated her. And this story has come out where oh Bernard Laffer, he was actually like a high flying mob lawyer. So this is a guy Epstein knew as a kid. The guy lived outside the gates of Seagate, but oh man, I guess one of the most interesting things, I don't think I can put it in my book, but I can tell you here, is that this guy Bernard Laffer, he knew the Paul Vario mafia crew because like unlike Epstein, the other kids that lived outside Seagate, it wasn't uncommon for them to like get a job as an errand boy for a mafioso on Coney Island. And so he described it like, oh, they'd give you like 6 brown paper bags and you'd walk around getting them whatever they want. And then once they trusted you, you could go out and deliver cash for them and place bets and buy them alcohol or watch their Coney Island amusement ride that they owned while they're in the back, probably socializing with a woman. Um, and he told me some crazy story about like all these. So there's a film called Goodfellas, if you've ever seen it. It's with like Robert De Niro, Ray Liotta, Joe Pesci is in it. And so this guy knew the character that Joe Pesci played. He said, but the guy in real life was like 6 foot tall, very handsome. And they would hijack, like in the movie, they would hijack trucks. This was the mob back then. Um, and he said, like all these guys went to one of the mob associates was Jewish. It was like Jewish and Italian the mob in the 1950s and 60s. You still found like a high number of like Jewish Americans who were in organized crime. um I think that's kind of gone away in the since like the 60s or 70s. It slowly, like, you find less, but you still find a fair number of, there's still some Jewish organized crime in the United States. um but I guess like one of the associates had a child, and the child was going to have a circumcision. And he said they brought all these like mob guys from the Paul Vario crew. I guess Paulie didn't go to this, but these other guys did, and they're all like snorting cocaine. And they tried offering the rabbi cocaine, and the rabbi is like 80 years old. And he said like these guys had all committed hits before. Most of them had killed people, but when it came time to snip that child's foreskin, they were like, "Oh my god, I can't go in there, man!" It was like the worst thing they'd ever seen. But they were mob guys who killed people. So these are people that like Jeffrey Epstein didn't hang out. Like he knew like he'd interact with them, but these are like kids that lived outside Seagate. So for like people that lived in Seagate, where Epstein and his brother lived, it was like he said there was a big marijuana market in the 60s and 70s for the Seagate kids, but childhood friends said like Epstein and his brother, like they like would never touch drugs, maybe have a glass of wine at a social occasion, but they were
Mhm.
pretty straight edge apparently.
That's what I read too, is that he was sober mostly.
hmm Yeah, there's no
Yeah.
known drug use, and Epstein was into like Whole Foods and veganism and stuff like long before uh, the rest of the population was. He was like really into it, like in the I don't know how long ago it was, but he was always pretty healthy.
Mhm. Sure, sure. what do you know, and what do you think about his brother, his younger brother Mark, and what was that relationship like to your understanding?
They I don't know if it was always the case, but there was a real sibling rivalry there, or as
Really?
far as can be told. I don't know if it emerged in adulthood or if it was there since childhood. Um, but his brother Mark is not, not like his brother in the sense that he likes, as far as we can tell, likes adult women at least. Um, or has dated and has had children and family with adult women. His brother's secretly, connected to some relatively powerful people. Maybe he's not so public about it, and he's not like a well-known person like Jeffrey was, but among like he would, I heard stories about him hanging out with Mayor Bloomberg one time, and he would travel on Epstein's plane quite a bit. When Epstein first got the plane, you can see that his brother would be on it more often. But then they had like a little bit of a rift, and some of it might have been over caring for his mother, which I think a lot of that may have fallen on the brother. Though Epstein's staff would do stuff; they'd go shopping for Epstein's mother. So Epstein's mother had a really bad car accident in Florida, and like I think she couldn't like really talk too well. But his mother, everybody who ever met his mother said like she was the nicest person alive. Um, like even like his, I think Juan Alessi and his wife said that she was such a funny lady. He's in a deposition. He said this. Childhood friends are like that family, like those parents. Like we have no idea how that monster of Jeffrey Epstein could have come from those parents. So like everybody I've ever met from that neighborhood to this day, they just sing the praises. Like his mother was like the kindest woman you'd ever meet, and she was always like helping people. And I think they took in a guy named Gary, who I've interviewed multiple times, Gary Grossberg, and he lived in the Epstein's house in high school for a few years because his parents got divorced in 1960s. When your parents get divorced in that neighborhood, it was a real huge stigma. Like you'd have to leave the neighborhood, but he got to stay there and
Sure.
stay in the school there.
Why do you think he was the way he was, given the parents he supposedly had?
That's a tough one. I tried I tried seeing, was there ever any other evidence that like maybe he was abused as a kid? Because sometimes that could be a trigger. Um,
Right, right, of course.
some offenders, it's like they grow up doing it. Some like, you talk to some victims like, and they just didn't know better because like from the age of 4 or 5, I mean, there was an adult sometimes abusing them, and they thought because that's an adult, like this is what you're supposed to do. Um, and there's all kinds of shame and stigma. But one of the weird, I guess another weird one, and I think this has been pointed out before. So when Epstein was 14, he went to this summer camp called Interlochen. From the trial, we know that he got victims from their
Yeah.
adulthood. Um,
Traverse City, Michigan.
yeah, Traverse City,
That was the airport
Michigan.
they would fly
Yeah, that's
into.
the
Yeah.
the TVC airport where you could see his plane landing there every summer, until the early 2000s. Um, But when he was going there, it was shortly around or before the time that this other pedophile, a rich guy from Michigan, from a prominent family, um, he had a pilot's license and a small plane. He could transport a few people on the plane. And he bought an island in Lake Michigan called North Fox Island. And I think he had a little airstrip so he could land the plane there. And it turned out that this rich guy was molesting all these boys from schools in Michigan. I think they were predominantly in Michigan, and they had a pedophile ring where they'd
I
have like
heard about
teachers.
this. I heard about this when I was in Michigan in 2020. A local told me about this. What was
Yes.
that rich guy's name? I can't remember.
Oh, Francis Sheldon, I believe.
Okay, yes, yes. Yeah, I read about this once. Yeah, and it was what was the location of the school again? It was on the island, right? Wasn't it? It wasn't on the island?
Well, they were getting kids from schools on like in Michigan, but the island was called North Fox. It was a small
Mhm.
island. I think there's like a South Fox and a North Fox. And the North Fox, he bought it from in the 60s. This guy bought it from this like wealthy woman who had it. And I don't know if she lived there, if she just owned it. but he was able to get it. I think he got a good. I think he didn't pay too much, or maybe she was unwilling to sell, and then he doubled the price because he was rich, and she sold it. And so he basically set it up to sound like a nature camp, and be like, and they would like trick the parents into like, oh, your son has been picked for doing so well in his gym class to have a summer trip to this island and nature preserve and all this stuff, Boy Scouts, right? And these
Mm,
poor parents are probably like, "Oh, that's so great! Wow, yay!" Because we could never afford to send them to any camps or anything. And wow, this is great. I mean, it's all about tricking the parents. Um,
right,
and
right.
so he
Yeah,
would fly boys in there, and it turned out that this island was like an epicenter of child pornography because like when you I guess one of the
yeah.
kids when you got there like everybody's naked and like, oh yeah, take your clothes off because that's what you're supposed to do. And they just like there were cameras set up everywhere. um, but it's even more nefarious because there was this other guy that was like his financial advisor, and he was a pedophile, and he was a pedophile, as far back known pedophile by the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts have these files on like the scoutmasters who were pedophiles because the Boy Scouts knew back in the 30s that men who want to molest boys become like get involved or work for the Boy Scouts. They gravitate towards it. So they'd have like files. Like once they'd catch someone, they say you can't hire them ever again, and here's the file. So you can actually get
Mm,
the file for this guy. This guy like faked his death. The financial advisor, and he had gone from like state to state, joining different Boy Scout organizations, and he was like Jeffrey Epstein because he was a genius at tax evasion. And so they actually set up the this is so heinous. They set up their the camp so that the child pornography that they would send it through the this is back in the before the internet. They would send it through the mail like in a brown paper bag, and what they would do is they would sell subscriptions, and the subscription is really like you pay the money and you get the child porn. But not only that, you don't pay like a company, you pay a nonprofit. And I think they had it was called like Father Paul's Children's Mission, right? So they gave it that name, and they had IRS 501c3 status, nonprofit. So pedophiles could buy child porn and then deduct what they paid for their child porn on their taxes.
Tax deductible. Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
So this guy
mind blowing.
later stole money from the wealthy pedophile. And the wealthy pedophile found out that the Michigan State Police were going to arrest him, and he fled to the Netherlands, which is another, when you think about it, of course that's where he fled to because the Netherlands does have a reputation for child pornography. Um, oh yeah, there's me. Um, but yeah, like
Can you repeat that? What you just said about the Netherlands there?
yeah, so the Netherlands has a long reputation, I believe, for like the production of child pornography, and child prostitution. So the wealthy pedophile that owned the island, like he was a millionaire, he fled to the Netherlands, never to be heard from again. But he was still he would file and he would have lawyers represent his estate in the United States even when he was on the lam. Um, and this other guy, the guy Malcolm McConaughey, who worked for him, um, he changed his name to Adam Starchild, and he had all kinds of he wrote books on tax evasion and like living as like a nomad basically, where you would go from place to place. And I guess his fantasy would be to have his own island. And it's like weird how all this parallels kind of like Epstein's life, and you wonder, hey, maybe Epstein was one of the boys that like I don't know if interlochen students would be brought to the island, but I do know that Sheldon did fund a scholarship for an interlochen student at one point. I don't know if it had any recruitment attached to it, but
And this is like a feature you did once, right?
yes.
Uh,
Trying to
looks like
remember
you were
which one.
interviewed by an outlet.
Is this the Discovery Channel documentary? Yeah, I think so. Oh yeah, they filmed this at a defunct because I couldn't get out to New York or wherever they were, and so they came to like Newark, New Jersey, and there was an old police station, and they filmed my interview in there. It was kind of cool. I walked around and they had old riot gear and stuff like that. It was like Newark had riots in the '60s, and all the riot gear was sitting in the jail cells. It was really weird. Um,
Oh wow. Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, do you recall what you guys covered in that particular piece?
Yeah, I think it was called the documentary. I think it was called the Death of Jeffrey Epstein or something like that. And they wanted me to talk about like his death, and I think like the final fu to victims was like how he changed his will 2 days before he allegedly committed suicide, which sounds like a kind of like a premeditated act to try, like it was his attempt maybe to deny victims from being able to sue his estate, because traditionally what happened in the Virgin Islands is like an estate, the courts were so slow there that it would take like 10 years from the person dying to their like loved ones getting any of their like money of their estate, because the courts, they had like one or two estate lawyers on the whole Virgin Islands complex. But I think this case, like I think his estate, his attorneys, I suspect that they got freaked out when like the Virgin Islands prosecutor started calling them captains. I think there was the Epstein estate started moving on certain things. I think like they paid his full taxes. Epstein would roll over his grave if he knew that like his estate paid all the taxes on that he actually owed. If he was a I mean, if he had left his estate to his girlfriend, he would do it in such a way that like if he knew that he was going to die, he never would have allowed any taxes to be paid on it. That was that was Epstein's forte, never like not paying any taxes or paying as little as possible. Um, but like I think the executors of his estate started to get a little bit frightened, and I think they're going to have a hard time finding new employers. Like, what are you going to say? Oh, my last employer was Jeffrey Epstein. It's going to be persona non grata. Maybe there's a Russian oligarch in exile that like they can work for, but not sure. Oh yeah. So like when I first started talking to the media, I had this one weekend when Epstein got arrested, and I got like my phone wouldn't stop ringing. And the New York Times reporter, I did help him. I was like, okay, Epstein had another client that I found in a lawsuit, and it was Elizabeth Ross Johnson, Johnson and Johnson family heiress. I don't think he only did a couple of like real estate type things for her because he was so busy with Wexner, that I don't think he could actually, because he really most of his time was spent like doing stuff for Wexner. Like he was like a jack of all trades, like from firing people to setting up tax advantage trusts to provide Wexner with an income from his stock, to like picking out like the who was going to build Wexner's yacht, to what art pieces he had, to what Epstein was likely stealing from Wexner, whether I don't know if it was stolen or not, or if Wexner let him have it. But a lot of Wexner's stuff became Epstein's stuff, real estate. Um, Epstein got the plane that Epstein bought. He got a deal on that. The big Boeing 727, because that was limited, a corporate jet from the limited. So I
Mm,
think he got it like allegedly like 10 million for a plane like that is a good deal.
okay. Okay. Wow. And what about Ghislaine Maxwell? What are your thoughts and understanding of her? And then how was your experience for the trial? Because you covered every day of the trial. Is that correct or no?
I tried most days, but I was
Mm,
teaching my
okay.
courses at college, so I kind of would go in and I would kind of tell my students like, "Oh, I went into the trial," and it was a criminology class, so they were kind of interested.
Cool.
How does a federal trial work, and all the stuff that you had seen and we sat through. Um, but yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell's got another, like it's like everything's like a rabbit hole with Jeffrey Epstein, right? So once you start looking into Maxwell, you automatically have to start looking into her father. Her father is like he's sort of like plucked out of World War II and became like an intelligence operator. Um, and how did he? The way that he did this, it makes a lot of sense actually. It's basically like when he was stationed, when he was with the British military, because he was from Czechoslovakia. He escaped the Germans, and then wound up like volunteering for the British Army to go and fight the Nazis. And at the end of the war, and at the end of the war, I believe he was like a newspaper editor, like because he had good reading and writing skills, and so they let him do like a military newspaper. I think he was editing a military newspaper, and while living in like Berlin, he started talking to like Germans who were publishers. There was one that, like, I think his name was Springer, and Springer's a big, well-known science publisher now. And I think back then it was too. And Springer allowed Maxwell to like become a partner in his publishing company. So Maxwell became like an owner of this German science publisher. Now, the reason that science publishing could make you really powerful if you started to like own up the presses that publish like scientific books is because it was like the dawn of the Cold War, where, you know, the Soviet Union and the Americans both kind of come into Berlin, and they're both trying to rip off as much German scientific information that is possible to gain an edge in the, you know, the nuclear age that's coming. And so Maxwell, it was Springer, and then later Pergamon Press were like quintessential science publishers. So you have like, if you're a science publisher, you have access to like scientists who want to like, you want them to edit your journals. They want to get published in the journals that you publish through your printing house. So you start to make contacts with like scientists all over the world during the Cold War. But Maxwell couldn't run a business. He couldn't run a business very well. He could buy them. He was really good at buying businesses. He was really good at being like his own publicist and putting on a good public image. But when it came time to run the business, he was like a dictator. And every decision has to come from him. And he would never listen to like, you know, the accountant says this, or the marketing person says we need to do this. He wouldn't really listen. He would just do whatever he wanted to do. So he was really good at buying up businesses. And then what he would do is he would then buy up, like he would have a business, he'd be running it, and then he'd start running out of money. So then he'd like take over another company and then use the money from that business to prop up his main business. And he would like kind of keep doing this. And the British actually caught on to this. And they wrote this big report in 1971 saying that like Maxwell was unfit to run any publicly traded company, and that like he shouldn't be running any company. It's basically their conclusion. And through that time, like he'd become moderate multimillionaire in Britain. And then he lost Pergamon. But by the mid 70s, he got it back and he recovered. And then in the 80s, he became like a tycoon. He bought up something called the British Printing Corporation, and then he renamed it Maxwell Communications Corporation. And then he bought this British tabloid called the Daily Mirror. And he had this rivalry with Rupert Murdoch. And all throughout this time, he's like one of these, the way that like intelligence seems to work, right? And governments don't want to like get their hands dirty. Like you don't want to have like a CIA employee, you know, bribing somebody. So you do is you go to like these, you know, seedy third-party businessmen like Robert Maxwell, and then you have him do things that like the government doesn't want to pass like some software along to the to a hostile country. Can I just I guess my battery in my laptop's kind of running low, so can I just like pause it for a second, and however this works?
Yeah. Do you have to grab something real quick, Professor?
Yeah, I just gotta find electricity. I think I have to turn the light up. Yeah, 1 second.
Yeah. Do your thing. Yeah, I'll pull you out really quick while you do that, and then you know what? I'm gonna give people a second here, just as we let Professor do that. I'm gonna play. What should I play? Should I do? I won't do that. I'll play my intro for a bit here, while we return in just a minute here with Professor Thomas Volscho, sociology, criminology professor, and we're going to be talking more about Jeff Epstein and the Epstein network when we return.
Have you ever been convicted of a crime?
Yes.
What was the crime of which you were convicted? You in fact commit those acts?
I would invoke my Fifth Amendment right.
Privacy was very important to Jeffrey Epstein.
My sources tell me that somebody from British intelligence came through the vents.
Through the vents? What do you mean by that?
Through the vents in the cell.
Please state your full name.
Same answer. I'm Jeffrey Edward Epstein, and my residence address is 6100 Red Hook Boulevard in Virgin Islands.
Do you have any evidence to suggest otherwise?
The CIA was using children
compromise pedophile politicians.
Have you ever solicited a minor for prostitution anywhere at any time?
Again, I'm going to assert my right.
What'd you study?
Physics.
Mr. Epstein built little cabanas and beach houses all across the island.
66 different days that he violated his probation. He would go to the airport, jump in his helicopter, who knows where he went.
Yes, I report back to jail at 8 p.m.
Every single day?
Yes, sir.
Conspiracy, witness tampering, prostitution, blackmail, extortion, you name it.
Their goal is to cover this up.
Is it true, sir, that you have what's been described as an egg-shaped penis?
No, in fact, the Supreme Court recently said that the Fifth Amendment right is there to protect the innocent. So that's the way I'd like to answer that.
Talk about Jane Doe 102, Virginia Roberts.
What's the last name? How's it spelled?
Do you know Virginia Roberts?
So she's again who?
They're untouchable. So I understand people saying, why didn't you just go to the cops?
Prosecuted for these crimes.
Right.
Isn't that right?
They did.
Objection, argument.
Didn't matter. He owned the cops.
And calls for a legal conclusion.
Can you spell it? Can you spell it for me, please?
What's up, folks? We are back with Professor Thomas Volscho, talking about Jeffrey Epstein, the Epstein files, and his journey into researching this. He won the, collectively with ABC, Edward R. Murrow Award for Investigative Reporting for an ABC radio news podcast called Truth and Lies, Jeffrey Epstein. It's been featured in the Mirror, the Daily Mail as well, and he's a full-time sociology professor at the College of Staten Island. Twitter is tvolscho, TVOLSCHO. Link in the show notes, and we're just returning back here after a halftime, and I wanted to ask you further, Professor, about your understanding of the Epstein network. We were just talking a bit about Ms. Maxwell and her father, Robert Maxwell. You were kind of unpacking his history going back to World War II, and after the war, getting into publishing. First, it was with regards to science, and I think there was a translation of science documents as well, if I recall reading. And did you want to resume there as far as your Maxwell research?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like the FBI followed him in the 50s. I was able to dig up like old Pan Am flight manifests from Pan Am. I don't know why they're public record, but they are. I don't think that's the case anymore. In the 1950s, I guess you take a transatlantic flight on a Pan Am jet and your name winds up on a manifest and you can get that as a public record. And you see Maxwell, yeah, he's flying into the US. They had a place in New York that was part of his publishing. It was like, I think it was partially like a bookstore that sold the books that they published, and it was like offices in New York. And he would come in and like he would fly into like sometimes he'd fly into New Jersey, sometimes he'd fly into I think it was LaGuardia. I don't know if they called it LaGuardia back then, but maybe they did. And so he would fly in, and the FBI would follow him because they thought like, okay, this guy, he's this British publisher, but like he goes to the Soviet Union all the time, and he talks to our enemies, so we have to follow him. Is he a communist? Isn't he? And Maxwell was kind of weird because, like, I guess he was a capitalist because he owned a private company, but he would talk about like Marx and say he was a socialist. And I think he was just playing to the political tune of both sides, because he was like filthy rich, and he would publish these tabloids by the 80s that were like very populist, working class British tabloids. but in the 50s, the FBI would follow him, and they had like people. The FBI agents would sometimes rent a room like right next to his room in whatever hotel he was staying, and they would put listening devices against the wall and pick up what he's saying. And I remember one of the FBI reports said he speaks with excellent diction. And it's like, yeah, when you listen to him speak, he's like a master at the English language. He's got that particular upper class, classy kind of British accent.
Yeah. Isn't that, I read that's manufactured, like he just chose that accent.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, because he was multilingual. He was sort of like a very international. He was like a guy without a home country, because he was Jewish, and I guess if you're a Jew in Europe at the time, Israel didn't exist yet, so you don't have a home country. And he took on this like Sir Ian Robert Maxwell type of, right, like this very British. And I guess the Maxwell, I think it was like a Scottish connotation for whatever reason he chose it. And he was like this.
I read that it was because he got recommended it, I think from a friend or something while he was in the army, because it sounded like a British officer's name when he was about to join.
Yeah,
Britain.
I think that sounds like that sounds very familiar. That's somebody kind of maybe like guided him towards this name. And I think like, so he was like British, but like the British elite, I think like they never really accepted him, and he was Jewish, and there was a bit of anti-Semitism. But I think like once like there was a little bit of like an alienation with the British elite, and Israel started to become like a country that was, wow, this country, it's new, but it's pretty powerful, and it's got all this military hardware from the US. He started to like, I guess supposedly like he went there and felt like he had a home type of thing. It's kind of it's an interesting question of like this like Jewish diaspora and this guy without a home and all this stuff. But at the same time, like he was a crook too. Like this guy was, he couldn't run a business. He realized the power, right, of publishing and scientific publishing in the Cold War. And like I said, like he would be recruited, I think, to do launder money through his businesses, which he did. The federal judge in New York, after he died, said that like when he bought the New York Daily News, that he just used it as a vehicle to launder money, because that was like his last great stand was buying the New York Daily News. And Rupert Murdoch apparently laughed when he heard that he bought it, which pissed him. I'm sure he didn't make him feel good because he thought it would intimidate him. But anyway, going back earlier back in history, there was this software called Promise, which was developed by the law, an LEAA grant. Bill Hamilton was the developer. And so Promise, it's like an acronym. It's like an old-fashioned software, but it was really powerful at the time. And it was designed for like court cases, for prosecutors and law enforcement to like pull up all the previous offenses of like a criminal, right? So you'd have like all these databases you could put together, as opposed to the old days. You got to like call up all the police departments and try to figure out all the previous arrests. And it was pretty hard to do. But once you had it in the computer, you could do it. And New Jersey actually still uses it in our, it's called Promise Gavel. It's like the municipal, is it not municipal? It's like, I think it's the criminal database of court cases in the state of New Jersey. They still use Promise.
That's
but
absurd.
Promise,
that's absolutely absurd.
Yeah, it's such old software. It's like funky when you try to use it. But Promise in the early 80s was allegedly given or stolen by Maxwell and then sold with some type, like allegedly the Israelis put some type of backdoor into it, and that Maxwell was going on international arms dealer type market and selling it to different countries so that the Israelis could spy on those countries. Pretty brilliant idea. It's not like the easiest thing in the world to connect Maxwell to Promise. But I did find I had to dig a little bit, but I did find that, okay, there was a guy that worked at the Department of Justice who actually oversaw IT in the mid 80s, early 80s up until the mid 80s. And so he was in charge of Promise. So there was a public version of Promise that was like open source and free. And then there was something called modified Promise that could be used to like study organized crime, terrorists, and spy on people. And so that version was the one that allegedly fell into the hands of the Israelis, and that Maxwell had somehow either gotten it to them or basically became the salesman for it. I think the story goes, according to the Gordon Thomas book, that Rafi Eitan, who was like some master Soviet spy, came and pretended under a fake name to be like doing a tour of the U.S. Department of Justice, and somehow acquired a copy and took it in like some floppy disks and took it back to Israel, and then they like reverse engineered it or something. Maybe they had the source code. But eventually Maxwell became sort of like the salesman. And the one piece that I found that would link him together was there was a guy named George Viveris, he's a Greek name. I think he's from Pittsburgh. He worked for the DOJ. He was like a deputy attorney general because he wasn't really a lawyer, but he was like the head of IT. So he would have overseen the Promise software. And then in 1987 or 88, I found a corporate filing from the state of Virginia for Maxwell's company, Pergamon Orbit. And lo and behold, George Viveris was now the vice president of this Maxwell company. So I'm assuming that that company was sort of used to like sell the software. And then Viveris went on to work for British Aerospace, which is a big defense contractor outside of making planes. But yeah. So
is he still there? Do you know?
I think he's retired, according to his LinkedIn. Who knows if he'll talk? I've never reached out to him. Maybe he'll talk. Maybe he'll tell us, yes, I worked for Maxwell and helped him sell this software. But there is litigation from the creator of the software, who basically says that like the government just like stole his modified version of the software, which is his private copy or private, whatever, copyrighted his, the one that he worked on outside of the, regular version that they'd sell to court districts for their own use. So there's been a lot of litigation, and Maxwell's name appears in the litigation. And this is like the guy who's been like sued to death by the government. This guy, Bill Hamilton, I think his name is. Yeah, it's an interesting case. I mean, it's another rabbit hole, though. It's like an insane rabbit hole. So like I said, Jeffrey Epstein story full of rabbit holes.
No, yeah, definitely. And what was the name of the woman that Epstein was supposed to marry? The middle school.
Kathy, and her last name. I know her married last name from the first husband. Oh, what was her last name? It's Kathy Sutman. I have it in my notes. I can't remember, but I believe it starts with an S.
Okay.
Sutter, Suter, Kathy Sutter.
Okay. That's Kathy with a K.
Yeah, and you know what? She did modeling for like a department store when like her and Epstein were kids. So she was, you can as a harbinger of things to come, right? This is like this girl. He knows she does like modeling for the local department store.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
And she became a teacher the year before he went to Dalton. She became like an elementary ed teacher in the New York City public schools. Sorry, I cut you off there.
No, that's great. And so, did they break that off before he went to Dalton then, or?
No, they were like, I guess they were like on and off. So there was like a period. It was her and Epstein, and then like I don't know if they drifted apart. And then it was Bernard Laffer was dating her, and she wanted him to marry her, and Laffer was like in law school, and he was just kind of starting out, and I guess he didn't want to commit to like a relationship like that. So then by like the late 70s they broke up, and then her and Epstein were together. Might have been 76 or 77, but the marriage license was 77.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got a question here. Hi, Thomas. Just wondering, the corrupt school administrator you spoke of early in this stream, was it Jack Goldstein by any chance?
Like the one in my town in New Jersey? No, it wasn't Jack Goldstein.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I would be interested in writing a bit about it. So I'd love to hear more about it. It sounds like maybe that was the start of your independent journalism career. I don't know.
I think it could be, because I did a lot of like academic. I still do. I mean, I kind of mix the two, but like I learned a lot of this investigative journalism from the school administrator stuff and digging up documents. And yeah, and this guy, like, because New Jersey, the corruption is so bad, like they gave him a golden parachute, and like they allowed him to resign. They gave him the remainder of his salary. They let him keep his laptop and his cell phone that were provided by the district with taxpayer dollars, which I suspect is because there's probably some evidence on there. We're still fighting to get a report that what happened was like, and we got attacked like by the school district like crazy. And everything we did was just like fact, 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 and people couldn't handle facts. In the school, like the school board, like finally, like the public outcry, because a lot of people didn't like the school superintendent. The public outcry got pretty bad, and so they the school district hired like a third party law firm to do a independent investigation. And of course we're like, oh god, it's headed by the former attorney general of New Jersey, who worked under, Chris Christie. So like, we'll see what kind of whitewash they do. But they end up concluding what I concluded. They got paid $80,000, and I got, I think I spent, $75 in postage and like fees to dig up everything. And time, of course, took a lot of time to do this. And we're fighting through public records law. There were 2 court cases in New Jersey that make it such that we're probably going to get their law firm's report. It should be a public record. The school district has been fighting us for years to not give us the report, because we think the report is going to show lots of politicians were trying to cover up for this guy. Yeah, so I guess that's what it was. It's really just like learning public records law, which I learned a lot on the job. New Jersey is kind of cool because you can hire a lawyer to help you, and then if you win, the government agency has to pay your lawyer like their court costs.
Wow.
So it's
Very
kind of
nice.
cool.
Is that the strategy you're taking for this particular case? Because it's a public school, right?
Yeah, it's a public school district. And, like in New Jersey, the property taxes are insane. So like, what are we getting for the property taxes? We're getting a guy who lies on his resume and hires the mayor's son to be like a high school coach, who's the mayor's son's a dropout alcoholic, and he's going to be the baseball team's coach. Meanwhile, a teacher who had minor league experience isn't getting the job. So it's just like, what kind of district are we running here? We're covering up secretaries, stealing my kids' field trip money from their account in their school. There's so much. I mean, like we had one of the coaches almost ran over a kid. The coach was drunk and he was driving his golf cart over the field, and we've got surveillance camera of it, which we had to fight for that. There's just so much to name, and I think that's like these school systems, institutions, school systems. They have people that do wrong, and they routinely, just as a matter of routine, like they cover it up. All institutions in society have all these like cover up mechanisms for, and it's not just like, it is, some of it's child molesters, teachers and people who molest children, but some of it's just like run of the mill, like fraud and theft, and they have PR strategies, and like it's insane what they do. It's mind boggling. You could just spend the money on like new books for like the science course, because the kids have old books, or maybe better teachers, or a teacher's aide for an overstressed teacher.
So is it your contention that these politicians were helping to cover up for this fraudster superintendent, because by then he had ingratiated himself via the mayor and the mayor's son, etc.?
Yeah. He had basically become like because the school district and the mayor's office are supposed to be like separate entities. But like what happens is like the mayor, who's part of an old-fashioned political machine, which we have in New Jersey, meaning that it's almost like you have like, the Sopranos in New Jersey. But if you look at like government, it's actually like the Sopranos. Like the government has like these fiefdoms with these different political bosses, and they have like an organization full of cash, meaning like their party machine, and they give out jobs to relatives and friends and unqualified people. They give contracts out. They spend taxpayer money on, themselves. They buy stuff for themselves when they're supposed to be buying it for, purchasing something for like, the whatever entity they oversee. And it's like a big favor mill. So like he would hire people that the mayor wanted to be hired as teachers, or a teacher would screw up and the mayor would call in and like save his or her job. and like there's all kinds of money. The amount of money, it's like $160 million public school district. I mean, that's an insane amount of money to have a guy. Oh, and the superintendent was borrowing money from his subordinates, which is imagine your boss asking you for a loan. Like, are you going to go and ask your boss to pay you back? Because he knows that, like, his employee is going to be really reluctant. We found one employee who loaned him $11,000.
Wow.
Insane.
Yeah.
But
especially
yeah.
given the the relationship of that not being your peer. But from what I understand, New Jersey is still or is the worst in terms of that of ingratiated nepotism politically, and with really the mafia, kind of like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, they're still here. The mob is still here. But the politicians, like, they it's like they divide up the state like mobsters. Like, the government is like each piece of government is one person's fiefdom. And so we have like a political boss in South Jersey. We have a couple in northern New Jersey. And then you have like, and then I'm looking at like, geez, if we send stuff to the prosecutors, they're all friends. So like, no wonder, like when we have sent stuff to the prosecutor, because some of this stuff is criminal, there's never any prosecutions. They all get quashed. And we think it's because there's like one of them's a former governor. And we think he's like one of the main bosses. And we think that like he is able to effectively like quash any type of county level prosecution. And we have noticed that he's really nervous about who the next attorney general of our state is. And we think that's because he's got some issues.
And what's his name?
His name is Cody, Codey, and he's clean as a whistle. If you Google him, he's like clean. He comes across as like there's never been anything, and he's like this average guy who became governor. He wrote a book called "What Me Governor," like Alfred Newman from Mad Magazine or something. So I believe he's involved at some level in activities that are not necessarily ethical and possibly unlawful. I think like he's the head of it, and he's been in government longer than anybody. And I think it's because like I saw an interview of him one time, and he was saying that like they were like, "How did you get your start in politics?" And he's like, "Oh, when I was a teenager, we were hired by some politician to knock down the other guy's signs." Right? So like that's how you got your start in politics, was tearing down like campaign signs. And he said like, and then we came up with a great idea. We take money from all the politicians, and then we decide whose signs we're going to rip down, and the person who we didn't rip their signs down would usually win. And so it's kind of like an interesting like way to to be beginning your life in politics. But I'm not going to say too much because I don't want to get like sued.
Sure. No, I'm just curious. I don't know too much about New Jersey politics, so I think the audience finds it interesting.
Yeah, we found, what was it? This new attorney general lives in a house that was once a brothel. It's in the paper. And I looked it up.
Really?
I'm like, oh my God, there was a big bust. There was an elite brothel owned by this woman who was a former Playboy bunny, bought this really expensive mansion in New Jersey. And New Jersey has a lot of like in Morris County, a lot of corporations have their headquarters there. It's really interesting. So there's all these like big pharmaceutical company that makes like Cheez-Its, Mondelez, and snack crackers. Big companies, blue chip Fortune 500 companies have these little corporate the Cheez-It loving juror. That's funny. They have
mentioned Cheez-Its.
Anyway, so they have like private jets, because you'll be out and like going to like Target, Target department store, and then you see like these little private jets flying over the road, and it's because there's all these like corporate executives come in. So basically, this woman had this mansion that she turned into a house of prostitution, and it was all like men from Fortune 500 companies coming in, I guess, in the afternoon for their afternoon activities, and so she got like busted, and it was in the late 90s. So today, this like, why would this deputy attorney general, like, why would you buy that house? Right? That doesn't look good, but
yeah,
such is Jersey.
Yeah, it's interesting. What about the well, I mean, what did you think about the trial? I guess I wanted to ask. I don't know if we covered that. in terms of your experience covering it, if you had any trouble getting into the courthouse, and what he thought about the mainstream media's coverage of it. Yeah, what's your take on that? And then if you
So,
want to talk about Jurgate too, just as the most recent development.
oh sure. So I thought that so it was a federal trial where they generally like don't allow. It's not like court TV covers federal trials. They have this old regulation going back a long time. I remember it's like in the '60s where you couldn't like have a radio. Back then it was more radio, but now it would be TV. Like you couldn't broadcast federal trials. Um, Whereas like with the OJ trial, it's a state, excuse me, murder thing going on. And they could broadcast the OJ trial. I'm old enough to remember as like I was in high school at the time, and like it was on every day. It was like the OJ trial's on, like every minute of the court day of OJ on trial was on TV. It was like the beginning of like court TV, but it was on like the major networks would have it on too. Um, but the federal system, you're basically, there's a few people that can bring in, like, I guess if you're in-house press, you can live tweet the court proceedings, but you can't broadcast it. But you can get in if you can physically get to the courthouse in New York. And a lot of people, COVID travel restrictions, couldn't get in there. And then when you get in, you got to fill out the COVID whether or not you had your shot. You got to take your temperature. You got to leave your phone and your laptop with the the security people at the front desk. And so you're basically going in there with like a notepad and a couple of pens. And I brought my watch because you don't have your phone. A lot of people don't have time, but I have my Timex, so knew what time it was at all times. And I was able to get in there. There was overflow. The first I went before the trial started to like the preliminary hearings. There was like one really big preliminary hearing that Vicky Ward was even there. I got a better seat than Vicky Ward one time. I was in the juror box where before the trial started, that was like the best seat in the house.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I got to see, it was like the first time I'd seen Maxwell in person, and saw her kind of walk in. She took her mask off, put her mask back on, and it was like, oh, there she is. She's wearing the same clothes that she was described as wearing the first time, or the recent time somebody had reported on seeing her. So it's basically like an old-fashioned thing, and it's harder to cover than a lot of trials. I guess there was a few journalists that I had met that had covered the R. Kelly trial, and that court, although it's also a federal court, in Brooklyn, it handled things. There's a little bit more coddling of the press, and here it's a little bit more. The Southern District of New York was a little bit more like a little strict, maybe in certain ways. But you got to be up and close. Like I was the first day. I remember I'm standing in line. I'm like, hey, I'm behind Isabel Maxwell. She's buying a sandwich. I'm standing in line behind her. I was like, I didn't think this would happen today, but that was interesting. And I was saying, maybe I won't talk to her because I don't want to piss her off. She's probably hungry. Maybe sooner or later I can talk to her. I never did. Well, I mean, I got to listen to her a little bit. I guess we talked to her the other day a little bit.
Yeah,
she seems to really take a liking. She opens up to you, Addie. I could tell, like they both are cracking a smile. They were like, they like you. You're gonna get the exclusive.
Maybe. Yeah, we did talk to her the other day, though. It was, it was interesting. I was gonna pull it up here. I think I can, but I won't play the audio, but because people, I think I've seen it. But yeah, Aaliyah Safian as well, our California lawyer friend. So
that's the woman that many people believe was involved in the photoshopped picture of Ghislaine Maxwell eating at a In-N-Out burger in California, right?
Yes,
it was kind of like the, fake left, go right type of thing, having that all over the news media, thinking that, oh, Ghislaine Maxwell's actually in California. She was like, where's Waldo for quite a long time before her arrest. And so allegedly Leah Safian, there was some metadata from the picture, I guess, that went back to her. But Maxwell was, after she sold her New York, it was kind of interesting how it happened. In April of 2016, Maxwell's about to close the sale of her Manhattan townhome and move to Massachusetts, and she does. But then she gets called back in, I think like a couple days after she finally buys the house in Manchester, Massachusetts, the big $2.4 million house. And then like I think a day after the ink is dried on the deed or the paperwork for her house, she's got to go back down to another deposition for the Virginia Giuffre defamation lawsuit. But that's where Ghislaine Maxwell, she was up in Massachusetts and New England for a few years. And then, the final flee was to New Hampshire. But she did go to New Hampshire and visit anyway. And one of her Terramar employees used to go hiking with his girlfriend up in the mountains in New Hampshire, take nice pictures up there. And she had a whole life. She was a stepmom. She had married Scott Borgeson, although everybody in the media has looked for the marriage certificate and nobody can find it. I mean, I tried Iceland. I mean, I called I think it was about 40 towns in New England, town by town, trying to find her marriage. Where did she get married? And New Hampshire has a little bit of I think it's not public record for 50 years or something. And I tried Nevada, a couple places in Nevada, Vegas, California, Iceland. And then one idea is maybe her and Scott got married at sea because they both are ocean lovers, and maybe they went out onto a boat and got married, because I think a lot of boat captains, there's a subset of them that can perform marriages at sea. It's kind of
really,
yeah, it's like an old-fashioned thing.
Wow, maybe I should do that when I
and
need to get married. I don't know why would I need to get married, but
I don't know. Taxes, you can lower your taxes, right?
I'll go out to sea and do it. Yeah, I'll have to find a skipper that knows how to do that.
Yeah, there might be a real cheap one on coast of New England, a lobster fisherman or something. But Maxwell was like dropping the kids off to school.
Wow.
She Scott, her ex, I don't know when they're going to get divorced or if they got divorced, and that's also another, we got to look for that, the divorce record. But he was in the Coast Guard, and he used to pilot these really fast kind of swift boats that they would use to chase down, the Coast Guard would intercept a boat coming into the US with a bunch of drugs on it. But I found Scott's boat, and it had a diving platform on the back, and it was docked in Manchester. And it was what was it called? A protector boat. And he had 350 horsepower engines on the back, and that thing can move. That's a fast boat. And I think he used to go out in New England. If you live in New England, when I was in 5th grade, we go up to Massachusetts and we take a boat to go whale watching. It was the big 5th grade trip. But I think Ghislaine used to go with Scott, and she used to go whale watching with her camera and take pictures of whales off the coast of Massachusetts when she was living there. I know she got. I have a copy of her when she got her beach pass. Her dogs were registered there. Captain Nemo was her dog's name, and she said it's not the Disney movie, it's the Jules Verne Captain Nemo. She would always correct people about that. But she had this whole post Epstein life with Borgeson up in Massachusetts, and she was a stepmom, and she even did a presentation to a 5th grade class there for Terramar. She brought in a bunch of junk from the ocean with her, the guy that was working for her, who's some kid from Long Island. He's in his maybe 25, and he was I think Maxwell kind of stepped back from Terramar because of that Daily Mail stuff kept coming back to haunt her, and she put this guy from Long Island. He's all about the ocean. This guy's he's really an environmentalist. He's all about the ocean. He's a surfer. And do
you know his name?
Yeah. Oh, what's his name? Brian with a Y. Uratzis. Yeah, you can see him on all the Terramar tax returns.
Okay.
I think she kind of stepped back, and he was kind of doing a lot of the day-to-day work of Terramar. And Terramar, it was just Maxwell was she grew up watching Jacques Cousteau, and she was somebody who she would dive at when she was a kid. I think one time she got knocked out diving, and her father wanted to beat the shit out of her, kill her or something, Ghislaine, you cannot be doing that. I guess he heard from some Italian boyfriend she had at the time that she knocked herself out diving into the Mediterranean, and he flipped out. But
Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter,
yes.
Alexandra, was trafficked to Epstein. She did stuff with Virginia Roberts.
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Wow,
it's true.
crazy.
Yeah.
Not surprising. um,
Pretty
but yeah,
crazy.
I know that they hung. I know she flew. She flew on the jet. She's listed as a passenger on Epstein's flight logs. I know they gave money to her foundation. Epstein or Maxwell gave money to probably Epstein to her foundation. But Epstein actually seeded Terramar. Like one of the first big donations came from one of Epstein's early foundations that he was kind of getting all the cash out of it. And like I think he gave like $57,000 to get Terramar going. Terramar was never really that big. It was kind of just like, a couple, maybe $100,000, $150,000, and it would give out very small donations, mostly to just prop up Ghislaine's reputation. And they would go out and give presentations. I've got the paperwork and the copy of the check. She went to University of Texas one time to talk about the oceans, and because her sister was a professor there, Ghislaine Maxwell. And I think like Terramar got like $2,500 for Ghislaine's 45-minute speech. Yeah, so she did a lot of that stuff. She was at the you all know about the United Nations stuff, and
Yeah, what do you know about her UN connections? Because that was the objective, wasn't it? That was trying to the idea behind Terramar was to get close to UN globalist leaders.
Yeah, it's really weird what she was doing because she had that like Terramar passport. It's like you're a citizen of the globe or the ocean or something. I forgot exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And it's almost like
citizen, or I don't even know.
Yeah, like you're a citizen of the ocean somehow. Like I guess she's like claiming the oceans, right? Which that's a heck of a claim. Where maybe she could like declare like the ocean's her own sovereign territory. I don't know exactly what, but she has those connections. That family can get a seat at a UN table. Epstein got he got into and he didn't do it because he was like a powerful statesman. He just did it through money. He gave like $500,000 to the the Council on Foreign Relations, and then there's the other big one he was a part of, the Trilateral Commission. And what they internally what they call Epstein is a C note member, meaning he gives like $500,000, and then we say, oh yeah, he's on the Trilateral Commission. I think like he only showed up to like a couple meetings, and he didn't really, because he's not really. If you need to launder money or talk about like, I guess molesting children, laundering money, science, he could talk a lot about that. But like world foreign policy and stuff, I don't think like he'd have too much to add to a discussion like that. And he showed up, and he didn't wear like a suit. He would always wear jeans and stuff. And because when he was a kid, my theory is that like because one of his schoolmates told me is that like when they'd make the walk up Neptune Avenue to go to school, there'd be like 20 somethings there to steal lunch money from kids. These are like people in their 20s that are taking money from kids walking to school, and they would grab Epstein by the tie. And that's one of the reasons that like he probably didn't like to wear ties. So he would show up in jeans and a sport coat. That's like dressing up for him.
I read he got bullied by black kids when he was younger.
Yes, he really didn't like black people. Maybe because of that. Maybe there's other mixture of reasons. But he wouldn't go for a black victim. Like he wouldn't molest girls with darker skin color. I think like one victim said that they brought a girl who was I don't know if she was completely of African descent or a mixture thereof. And he got like, I think it might've been Haley Robson. And he's like, Haley, you can never bring this person here again. Though he did pay her for showing up. Because that was part of the thing, is to keep people coming to his property, keep like a steady flow of victims. But
right. Yeah. The enterprise or industrial scale of the operation, as you mentioned. A comment here. What about Haiti? Do you know anything about the Haiti connections with Epstein, his island, or?
Yeah, I don't think like because that victim, Haitian people being predominantly of African descent, that wouldn't enter his like victim profile. Like he wouldn't be attracted to children necessarily from Haiti. But there's plenty of child trafficking going on there. I don't know what his involvement would have been, and none of that's ever cropped up on my radar. But if it has, that's interesting.
Right, right. Okay, and I got another comment here. Maxwell wanted a presence in the United Nations to gain access to children for export and exploitation, in my opinion, says Beach Bum.
I mean,
what do you think about that?
I think, like, as far as we can tell, her molestation and recruiting of children was during her time with Epstein. And by the time he's in jail in Florida, for the most part, she seems to have taken a break. She has broken off from him and no longer works for him. And he's in the meantime, he's recruited other people to do her old job. Sarah Kellen. He has his New York people like Leslie Groff, allegedly, that do a lot of the recruiting of other recruiters. So Maxwell, I think at this time she was really trying to salvage her reputation. But the UN has problems with child molesters, right? They do have this problem where
Yes.
they supported and covered up people who've engaged in child trafficking under even child rape. UN peacekeepers who have actually done
Right.
this, which is a blemish, because there's some of the people they're UN peacekeepers, and then you have like a minority that are using it as a shield and a cover to molest children. But I
Yeah.
think, like, at that point, I don't think she was doing going after children anymore, as far as I know, unless there's this whole other secret life about her that we don't know. But it seems like once she was away from Epstein, that, like, she sort of stopped doing it, unless she was going to start doing it again. I don't know, but I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Right, right. And I wanted to ask you as well if you thought, well, going back to the Dalton School thing, do you think that it was the case that Epstein bewitched Barr and that was it, or do you think he was recruited into intelligence at some point during that process?
I mean, like, I haven't seen any evidence that he had anything to do with, like, government intelligence. When he was at Dalton School, he was basically a screw up. Like, he couldn't actually teach. I mean, like, for some students he was good, but for a lot of them, like, he just wouldn't do, like, basic stuff. Like, he was late all the time. He wasn't returning, like, their math homework. Like, he wouldn't grade it and say, as part of teaching, like, this is the answers you got correct and there's the ones you got wrong. And the faculty were like, we got to do something about this guy. He's a disaster of a teacher. So apparently Epstein went, I mean, I've heard conflicting things, but one of the things Epstein used to say, or he did tell a journalist one time, was that the father, there was an actress. She was a student in the 70s, but she later became a big actress. And I'll give you a hint: a dancing movie from the 80s with the co-star of Patrick Swayze.
Oh, okay.
That like Epstein went out to, like, some art gallery. He contended that she invited him to an art gallery, and he met her father, who was, like, a big theater producer at the time, and he was also an actor. And Greenberg, Ace Greenberg, who ran Bear Stearns he was about to take over Bear Stearns at the time, was there. And another telling of it was that Epstein got in touch with a member of the board of trustees once he figured out they were going to, like, they weren't going to fire him, but they were going to politely ask him to resign. But they allegedly removed him mid-semester. That's how bad he was. Before the school year ended. They usually wait till the end of the school year and let you resign, but apparently he was removed before the school year was over, and he was making frantic calls to the board of trustees. And then somehow Ace Greenberg's like, he's a math teacher, bring him in. And so Epstein got an interview with Ace Greenberg of Bear Stearns and this other guy that was like he wasn't the head of human resources, but he was like a level below Greenberg at Bear Stearns. Now, keep in mind, Bear Stearns at this time in the 70s, Bear Stearns is like a mid-level bank. It's not like the Bear Stearns that blew up in 2008 when it was a huge bank. It was kind of the middle level. And at the time, Epstein came in and he's like, "Do you know what a stock is?" And Epstein's like, "No." "Do you know what a bond is?" Epstein's like, "No." Well, you're good at math, right? He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty good at math." He's like, "So do you want a job here?" And Epstein's like, "Excuse me?" And Greenberg goes, "Well, if you're so fucking smart, don't you understand English?" Because that's what Epstein said, that Greenberg, that's how he basically hired him. And Epstein came back and he's like, "We can teach you, teach all that stuff, but if you know math, we want you." And it was because at the time, financial markets were starting to become extremely mathematical. And there was this formula that was being used to price stock options. It was called, oops, excuse my phone. It was called the Black-Scholes pricing option, and it's basically like a normal distribution equation in statistics. The equation that sort of describes a bell curve, but there's some nuances to it. And Epstein could look at that and say, "Oh yeah, I know what this means." And so all the stock traders at the time had this equation written on a piece of paper, and Epstein would be like, "I don't know if that equation is right, but I can tell you what it means." And what's likely to have happened is Epstein probably went to the library and read like the critiques in some of the economics journals about the Black-Scholes pricing equation. And basically the critique was that, well, the equation is continuous, but the stock market closes at 4 o'clock every day, and then other things happen in the meantime. So how can you use this equation to price movements in stocks? So Epstein allegedly modified the equation a little bit to introduce functions that like stop and start. I don't know how true that's. Epstein, you never know if he's lying or not, but he probably could look at the equation with his math training and understand it. So what he did was he would help wealthy clients. He went to all different aspects of Bear Stearns. Like they had him go to the assistant to a trader, work in this department, that department. And then they figured out his talent, and his talent was like creating like packages, products for rich people to invest in that would like lower all their risk. And at this time, tax rates are still high on the rich. It's before Reagan cuts taxes. Once Reagan cuts taxes, I think a lot of this stuff was probably no longer of great value. But Epstein's there at Bear Stearns, and he's actually like skyrocketing through the place. And he's dating the daughter of, he's dating Greenberg's daughter, what does that tell you? And then one day, like the personnel department at Bear Stearns, they actually go through all the references and call up the college and make sure you graduated. So basically, Bear Stearns had his Dalton resume, which had those colleges he didn't really go to, Berkeley and Stanford. And they called up Berkeley and Stanford, and like none of these colleges have ever heard of him. And so this guy gets this frantic call from Human Resources, like, "Are you sitting down?" He's like, "Oh God, yes, I'm sitting down. Epstein's resume is all lies. None of these people have ever heard of him." And he's like, "Oh God, I have to go to the boss, Ace Greenberg, this guy's dating his daughter, and tell him that Epstein lied in his resume." So basically they haul Epstein in, and Epstein's like, "Well, I always knew I'd be a great teacher, and I was." And the guy's like, "Oh, we'll give you a second chance," type of thing. And Epstein was making money for them. He was making money. He was a great salesman because he's a good, likable bullshitter. So he was an amazing salesman. And he skyrocketed to limited partner at Bear Stearns, which is not a real partner, but it's like there's like 30 of them, limited partner. And that means you're like on the fast track to maybe becoming one of those, partners who owns a share of the Bear Stearns. And one of the things that he was doing is he was creating these packages of like low risk stock investments, or a mixture of like where you combine like the pricing options with a bunch of other strategies. And then he was creating packages to help clients reduce their income tax. So most of the Bear Stearns clients at the time were like mid-level businessmen with like a company that that started off small and got kind of big. So they weren't like, it wasn't like old money. There was a little bit of old money, but not much because it was Bear Stearns. Old money went to the other big banks like Goldman Sachs. And And Epstein, one of the things that like he ends up getting him, they fire him or they ask him to resign. It's unclear exactly which of the two, but he was having like affairs with a secretary. One of them was a I think worked for like the one of the big bosses who was really conservative, and Epstein told her he was going to marry her, and he would use his expense account to like take flights on the Concorde with her, and they would stay in all these fancy hotels in France and five-star hotels all over the place. Um, and he loaned his friend money to buy stock. His friend's wife claims it was to buy a condo. Um, and then the SEC gets interested in Bear Stearns because they handle this transaction that appears to have been like a really crazy case of insider trading involving this Swiss Italian trader. And Epstein like resigned like the day after the trade. So the SEC, of course, wants to go talk to Epstein, claims he didn't have anything to do with it. And then he's out on his own. And I can't find any intelligence connections at the time. I mean, assuming I've looked correctly, I can't find any. Maybe they're there. And then he's pretty much broke after he blows through his bonus. He's broke in 80, 81.
Mm-hmm.
And he finally gets an apartment on 66th Street, a one-bedroom apartment, where he lives for like 10 years. And in the early 80s, one of his girlfriends goes to a party and went to a party in Texas, Dallas. Epstein had this weird fetish for like cowgirls and Texas oil money, and Dallas was a big show at the time. And I think like one of the actors.
Didn't you say he liked cowboy boots a lot?
Yeah, he would buy cowboy boots for people. Like when he went to the Middle East, he would give like Saudi royalty. He would buy them cowboy boots and give them to him. One of the victims at Maxwell's trial said that like when she went to the ranch in New Mexico, Annie Farmer said they bought her cowboy boots.
They brought him out during the trial. It was a bit comedic, actually.
Yes, they like to prove that she had worn the cowboy boots, and so she couldn't possibly have been molested because she wore the cowboy boots, which doesn't make sense. I think she gave some interesting answer that like, I kept these boots from this weird encounter where they gave me a naked massage, and I am going to reclaim them and say, screw these people. I'm going to wear these damn boots and they're going to be my boots. And it's like this therapeutic thing that she did to kind of take her life back in a way. But anyway, so Epstein had this weird fetish with, if you look, there's a Cosmo Bachelor of the Month ad from 1980. And like he actually has his mail coming into Bear Stearns. 55 Water Street is where Bear Stearns was located at the time when the ad was in. He was still working there, 1980. And I think it said like if you're a Texas cowgirl or something like that, or something to that effect, it says in the ad, then write this dynamo, 55 Water Street, New York, New York. So anyway, that's when he was at Bear Stearns. So anyway, fast forward back into the early 80s. After he's at Bear Stearns, one of his girlfriends, who I think is Paula Fisher, he sends her, or she attends some party, and maybe he couldn't go. I don't know exactly what happened. And she meets this British kid whose father is Douglas Leese. And Douglas Leese, it later turns out, is kind of like Maxwell in a way. He's like this private businessman who does arms deals, right? He helps, like when the U.S. government wants to sell weapons to the Middle East, the U.S. government can't send an invoice over and have them pay us and wire the money and we'll deliver the jets. They have to have like a third party businessman do it. And I think it was like Lease was, a lot of it was like the British, because the Americans wouldn't always sell unmodified fighter jets to anybody, but sometimes they were worried that the Iranians might use it on the Israelis. So, but the British might be like, oh, we'll sell our fighter jets. So Douglas Lease is this British guy he'd worked in the U.S. before. And I don't know exactly how he got involved in the type of arms dealing that he was doing, but I do know that he started out in automotive manufacturing. He was an engineer, and his family had a company, I think, and they created, I think what they ended up selling was precision steering equipment, which has military applications. And then so TRW was a big defense contractor that made like ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they bought up this precision steering company. And Lease ended up working for TRW. And by 1979, he was VP of International Customer Relations, which is probably a pretty good way to become an arms dealer someday. You're developing all kinds of international contacts. You're part of a big Pentagon defense company, not owned by the Pentagon, but like a private company that does stuff with the Pentagon. So Epstein, so this guy's son is at this party in some oil tycoon's birthday party, and she meets this, I think it was Nick Lease, who's his older son, and she tells about her boyfriend Jeffrey Epstein and how they're thinking of visiting London. And can we come and visit you? And he's like, sure, come by the house. And he gives her the address. So Epstein and her, a couple months later, are in London, and they go out to meet Nicholas Lease. And Nicholas Lease is like, oh, my father's working upstairs. And like, I guess at the end of the day, his father came down and he met Jeffrey Epstein, and he was floored by him. He thought he was so interesting because Epstein is this great, charming salesman. He's like, he's a little, working class Brooklyn, a little rough around the edges, but like, he's brilliant. And like, I'd like to take him under my wing. And so Lease hires Epstein. I don't know exactly what Epstein did, but we think it's likely to have been financial stuff for Douglas Lease, like probably moving money through international places, probably for laundering money for arms deals. And so this guy, so Epstein is like working for him, and Epstein does this classic Epstein, which is like he wouldn't wear a suit to these dinners. So he would have to go to these dinners with his boss, and he wouldn't wear a suit. And I think there was a time when his Douglas Lease's boss got really mad, and he made him put on a suit. And he said like one time Epstein's at one of these fancy dinners, and like all of a sudden Epstein just gets up from the table and sits down at the piano and starts playing beautiful classical piano. And everyone is just like charmed and taken by Epstein. So Epstein's working for Lease for about 4 years, and then he, like Bear Stearns, he's stealing from his employer to he's abusing his expense accounts and taking trips and staying in all these nice hotels. And Lease gets really pissed at Epstein and fires him. And I never want to see this asshole again. And so Epstein's he was going back and forth between London and the U.S., but then he was kind of permanently back in the U.S., and this is where he gets some money. There's a couple of investors. I don't know how deep into the weeds you want me to get, but
please keep going. This is amazing.
So there was a guy from the Midwest who was the CEO of a pinball machine company called Williams Electronics. So if you go to like an old arcade, there's one down at the Jersey Shore. They have it's all pinball machines, and Williams Electronics, which later became or merged with Sega, like Sonic the Hedgehog Sega. Well, this guy, Michael Stroll, was like the CEO of this video game company, and he was a client of Bear Stearns. And eventually he was talking to somebody at Bear Stearns, one of Epstein's old friends, and he's like, oh, we have somebody who just left and started his own company, Jeffrey Epstein. He's brilliant, and you should go talk to him and think about investing with him. So I think Clark Schuback, who's now a big wig on Wall Street, but he basically recommended this guy invest with Epstein. And Epstein promised him an oil drilling deal, Texas Oil and all this stuff. And he took like $500,000. This is back in '82 from Stroll. And Stroll kept Epstein promised, oh, you'll be making like $30,000 a week. Once we hit this, we're still drilling, but we're pretty sure we're going to hit this oil. It'll be like one of the biggest proven reserves in Texas. So the guy, Epstein has the $500,000 and he's never seen a dime. And like 2 years later, he modifies his contract with Epstein in his lawyer's office. And Epstein's like, oh, no, we're going to hit it soon. And he said one day Epstein actually sent him a can of motor oil in the mail, and saying that he was claiming to his investor that, oh, we just struck oil. Here's a sample of the oil. And then he never heard anything. And he said for every 5 or 6 phone calls, Epstein might return one phone call. And it was always some BS excuse and this and that. And then it was like, oh, but I'm working on a new deal to take over Pan Am, and I might work for Leslie Wexner and all this stuff. And I think Epstein Epstein bought a horse at this time too. Epstein bought a horse, and Epstein lost the horse because Epstein wouldn't pay the stabling fees. And so he kept going after this guy. This guy kept trying to get his money back from Epstein, but the way that Epstein did it was very smart. Is that Epstein set up his shell company, which was called Intercontinental Assets Group, that he ran out of his apartment, to be the company that would accept the investment. So when the man comes back for his investment, Epstein can say, well, the company is broken, it's out of business now, or the company doesn't have any, it's insolvent. And so I was just acting in a representative capacity of Intercontinental Assets Group. Sorry. And so this guy never got his money back, save for one time when Epstein hooked up with a Ponzi scheme, and Epstein started to have a serious cash flow from the Ponzi scheme. Epstein sent him like a $10,000 check. And then Epstein, when the guy sued him, Epstein said, oh, that was for a horse I bought, which was, Epstein did buy a horse, but not from him. So Epstein was always good at kind of, mixing up the truth to create the lie. And so by 86, I'm pretty sure Epstein was like broke. Why do I say that? Well, because I have a copy of a lawsuit where his landlord sued him for not paying his rent. He was like way behind on his rent for his place in the Solo Tower, his 1-bedroom apartment. And then in 87, and there's conflicting stories, but Stephen Hoffenberg hires Epstein as a consultant at the Towers Financial Group. Now, the Towers Financial Group had already been selling fraudulent securities. I mean, I can go into a whole rabbit hole. Hoffenberg is an interesting character himself. He's a very, he's pleasant to listen to. He's he's sort of like an advocate for Epstein victims now that he's out of jail, but he went to jail for this Ponzi scheme. And, basically Epstein approached him, and Epstein didn't work. He was never employed by the Ponzi scheme. Epstein was smart. Epstein was a consultant through his company, Intercontinental Assets Group, which is the shell company, like he defrauded the other client with. And so what Epstein did was Epstein actually engineered this really brilliant idea. And it was basically to go, I guess there was an insurance company in Illinois that had borrowed money from Towers. And Epstein was, talking to Hoffenberg about like what kind of companies borrow money and do business with Towers. And he said, oh, there's these insurance companies that are under receivership in Illinois. And so Epstein engineers this really brilliant idea that they could promise to the Illinois insurance regulators that Towers is going to invest all this money into the insurance company that's like, it's in receivership. And that put it back on its footing, and then basically take over the company from the state of Illinois. And they promised to put like $1 million into it and to like stabilize its spending and what policies they're writing. So it's all a bunch of bullshit. I got all the correspondence through FOIA of Hoffenberg making these representations to the director of the Illinois Insurance Commission. And so basically they get hold of the company through false representations. And then they immediately, it's brilliant to take over an insurance company, because what do insurance companies have lots of? Money, right? Insurance companies, because if there's a disaster, they need to have cash to pay the policyholders' claims, right? So it's a brilliant idea. Take over an insurance company, and the best way to rob an insurance company is to own the insurance company, or own and control the insurance company. So that's basically what they did. They just raided the insurance company, and then Epstein said we could take money from the insurance company, and then we can go and buy such and such percentage of shares of Pan Am, the big iconic American airline, which its share price went from like $5. It was probably down to like $2.75 or $3. They're trying to buy like a controlling interest. And there's a way you can make money doing this without actually taking over the company. If you pump up, it's sort of like a pump and dump scheme that Epstein seems to have done here and there at this time. And they fail, and then they try taking over another little airline in Connecticut, and that fails. But Epstein walks away with $3 million out of Towers. And then he gets together with these other like corporate raiders, and they buy a company that makes football helmets. So Epstein is like on the board of this company that makes football helmets. It's called Riddell, Riddell. You may remember, I remember from youth football, that was the company that made the football helmets when I was a kid.
Yep. Yeah, I remember it. Yep.
Yeah. So at this time, in 87, I think it is, Epstein meets this guy on a flight to Palm Beach. And this guy later introduces Epstein. His name's Robert Meister. He introduces Epstein to Leslie Wexner. And so Epstein I think it was about 89, Epstein starts really calling in this contact and saying, oh, can I meet Leslie Wexner? And I'd like to get together and let me meet his financial advisor, and have Leslie Wexner actually sends his financial advisor out to 457 Madison to meet with Epstein. And the financial advisor walks away saying, this guy's like a fraud. And he reports back to Wexner. He's like, I don't think this guy is what he says he is. I asked him like basic questions and he won't give me a straight answer. Like, how would you do this deal? And like, where does the money come from? And this guy is like I would say he's a fraud. And Wexner's financial advisor was actually a finance graduate student, and he taught classes in fraud. So it's like the Epstein's worst nightmare. So Epstein starts like doing this, like spreading all these rumors that to Wexner personally and to Wexner's friends that, oh, Leslie Wexner's got to watch out. His financial advisor is stealing from him. Like, he should have a lot more money than he does. And like, what's going on? He should really look into him. And so Epstein convinces Wexner to hire him, and the other guy is still working there. This guy like set up Wexner's like family office. I guess Wexner wasn't a big charitable giver until about 87 or 89, somewhere between the two time periods. And so I guess Wexner had some kind of like accident, like he was skiing or something, and like he had like a near-death experience, and he said, I guess maybe what's going to be like my legacy? I'm a single 50-year-old CEO. I'm a billionaire. So I guess this financial advisor is like, you should start like doing charitable donations. And so he sets up Wexner's like family office, and Wexner starts doing a lot of charity around like Ohio State and the Columbus area.
Yeah, the business school at Ohio State is named after him, I believe.
Yes. And so that's like the beginnings of that. And there was this guy, because he's like, you'll see the fruits of your labor, before you die, like basically this type of thing. So Epstein like starts working for him. So now this guy has to work alongside Epstein, and he doesn't really like Epstein. He's like, Epstein's like coming in, he's staying at hotels, he's got a lot of girlfriends around. And this guy like, successfully convinces Wexner that like he's stealing from him. Meanwhile, this guy's got like accounting controls. He does everything like by the textbook of like to make sure that I'm not stealing. I have people watching me, and I'm watching everybody's kind of watching each other. And there's like all kinds of auditing and stuff. It's all like by the book. And like I said, this guy actually taught like classes on how to detect fraud at like, I think it was Ohio State or
okay.
Maybe
I'm sorry. It's the medical center they named after him. The Ohio State University
the medical center,
not the business school.
Yeah, he did he had like an old folks home. I think it was called Heritage Village or something like that. And then with Epstein, he started, he got his name on it. There's a building at Harvard. I think it's at the JFK school. If you go there today, you can see Leslie H. Wexner on the side of one of the buildings at the JFK School of Government. So anyway, this guy, like this Harold Levin was his name. He was his prior financial advisor. Epstein basically like edges him out. And like one day, Epstein comes into the office. He's like, look at this. I have power of attorney over everything. You work for me now. So this guy quits. And I don't know, his health went down the tubes. He couldn't find another job because Epstein had badmouthed this guy Levin to everyone.
He ruined his life, didn't he?
He totally ruined his life. You talk to him now, you could tell he's very kind of older and he's sick. He's sickly sounding. I'm sure it took quite a toll. But he said, at the time I was doing everything right and all this stuff. So Epstein comes around, and Epstein starts setting up like tax evasive trusts for Wexner. And Epstein, by having power of attorney, that means Epstein had control over like $2.5 billion of Wexner's assets. It's amazing. Why would you give? You're 50. You're in your 50s. You're perfectly healthy. Why do you give this 39-year-old guy from Brooklyn and Bear Stearns, right? Like you just give him like the keys to your castle. I know some people believe that it could be like blackmail and
Why do
things
you
like
think
that.
he did that?
I think that Epstein had a penchant for exploiting trust in people. And a lot of Epstein, like a lot of the men that Epstein got money from, they tended to be at this time Midwestern wealthy white men from the Midwest who are very like there's a lot more like trust in the Midwest than in like New York. So a lot of Epstein, so like Wexner, Levin was very trustworthy. Michael Stroll was from Chicago, right? These men that kind of trust Epstein, and for whatever reason, Wexner was kind of, according to certain people, Wexner was like this workaholic. There's been claims about like his sexual orientation, and whether or not he, like whether or not there was a vulnerability there. Could like the CEO of a big company that sells women's underwear, in the early 90s come out as a gay man, and maybe Epstein had known that, and I don't know. I've heard plenty of stories, but I've heard from people that worked for Wexner as investors, or like a boutique investor. This guy has no filter. He told me all about. He said Wexner. He's like, I showed up there and Wexner had this boy as a butler, and I don't think I think Wexner was undressing the boys, and I told him to undress girls. They're more fun. This really strange guy with no filter, who helped Wexner buy a company that dresses like heavy set women called Lane Bryant. Well, this guy helped Wexner buy that company, and Wexner approached him to buy Victoria's Secret, and he's like, no, I don't want my firm associated with an underwear company in San Francisco. So anyway, this guy says that like Wexner could never hurt a fly. He's very trusting. And then there's other people like Bob Fitrakis out in Columbus, who's a journalist you may have heard of, that he's claimed that like Wexner's company had like this aircraft company that was used by the CIA, then was suddenly brought into Columbus and may have been flying in stuff for Wexner. But if you look at Wexner's business, where he really wants to be is Mexico, right? He wants, because he's in the textile industry, he wants people paid low wages in Mexico, because that's the cheapest way to ship all the stuff for his stores, his retail clothing stores. You want it all to come from Mexico. So Wexner was like a real big, I think Wexner was one of the forces behind NAFTA, because his company, I think they made lots of money from reducing labor costs through NAFTA. Labor and transportation are the big costs when it comes to like clothing. So if you want to fill American shopping malls with your clothing, you get cheap labor in Mexico, sewing and whatnot, and then it's really not too expensive to ship from Mexico into the continental US. Whereas if you're getting it from you don't want to flying it in is kind of crazy to fly in that much cargo, maybe for like high end stuff from Europe. Yeah, that makes sense. But Wexner, he had been involved with like, he'd been in the White House in the 70s, as like a wealthy American Jewish person who's real interested in like what the US thinks of Israel. So I know I do have documentation that Wexner went to like on a trip to the White House in 1976, to possibly like lobby maybe for the interests of Israel, but I don't know. And I know he's donated a lot of money. He had one of his charities had like like Jewish Americans go and they go to Israel and they study and then they come back and like they get educated, and I think like the Iraq War, it's contended by some that like Wexner really had the ear of the Bush administration. Now you have to remember, Wexner was always a Republican. Epstein, I don't think Epstein Epstein didn't care about what political party, but we see that like, he spent a lot of time with the Clintons, and he may have veered more. And so it kind of might have been one of those things where like, Wexner, the Republican in the 90s, he's got to have Jeffrey Epstein, the Democrat, going into the White House to get like, favors and whatnot. But Wexner and Epstein did go to the White House together.
And was that Ford or Carter that was president when Wexner visited the White House? Do you know?
Yeah, I wasn't very clear there.
Okay.
Wexner went in the 70s. I think he
Mm.
probably, if we could get, if you dig into the Reagan and Bush administrations, I'm pretty sure Wexner would have been at the White House a bit in the 80s too. But when Clinton became president, Wexner, the Republican, the Clinton administration reached out to Wexner to come to the White House because they wanted to drum up support for Clinton's economic policies. And who should Wexner bring with him? His right hand man, Jeffrey Epstein. And that was like, I think, February 93. So Clinton had only been sworn in for like a month. And, Epstein got like his first taste of the White House, I think. I don't know if Epstein was there during the Reagan administration. He might have been if you can get all those records. I haven't tried. Maybe I will.
I wanted to ask you about the man you said introduced Wexner and Epstein, Robert Meister. Could
Yes.
you expand on that character? I didn't. I was unaware of this guy.
Sure. Robert Meister, he was the CEO of a big insurance company. I think it's spelled Aon or something like that. And of course, Epstein is also friends with his son. See, the thing about like Epstein with rich men, Epstein would often be friends with like their kids or their son. Like it's like a common theme you see with Epstein. He like courts the adult and their grown children, or maybe not grown children in some cases. But Todd Meister, I think, he was pictures of him dancing with Paris Hilton. But Todd Meister said Epstein told him some crazy stuff. I don't know if it's true, but what did he say? He said that like Epstein once bragged to him that he used to go into mental hospitals in New York and like have sex with mentally ill women that were locked up in psychiatric facilities. Because you have to remember, it was pretty easy to get into psychiatric facilities as a volunteer or just sign in, or you could even pretend yourself to be crazy and want to sign yourself into a mental hospital. But there was lots of like sexual abuse that went on in those places. And I think a lot of predators, they would go to these psychiatric facilities in search of victims. You have people that like maybe can't speak or they have other mental illness issues, or you drug them up or something, and you could commit sexual offenses against these people. But that's what Todd Meister was his son. So Robert Meister was the father. He was really wealthy. He was a guy that Epstein would probably go and talk to people in first class, and Epstein would sneak into first class, or he had these like stickers he got from like, I think in the 80s, he had these stickers that said first class, and he would stick them onto the ticket. And then like usually you could get into first class. And then I think somebody figured out that they were just stolen stickers or something, and they would get kicked out of first class. And I'm sure Epstein probably was in an embarrassing situation like that before.
Because he gifted them to somebody, and that happened.
He would give them out as gifts, or like, hey, stop by my apartment and I'll get you into first class. It's a very Brooklyn, like way about him, like doing stuff like that. It's like a little bit of a hustle, right?
Comment here says Todd Meister married Nikki Hilton.
Okay, he married Nikki Hilton. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know how long that lasted, but yeah.
Okay, is that any relation to Paris Hilton?
Yeah, I think it's the sister, a younger sister or something.
Wow.
I'm not a huge expert on. I remember it was like 20 years ago. These people were like
She's married to a Rothschild now, James Rothschild,
the banking family,
Rothschild.
Right?
Yeah. Wow.
And one of Epstein's friends, who used to own Ghislaine Maxwell's New York townhome, also married a Rothschild and allegedly introduced Epstein and Alan Dershowitz.
And
but
who is
Epstein's, that is her name was Lynn Forrester. Before she was Lynn Forrester, I don't know if she took the last name, but she was married to this New York politician named Andrew Stein, who Epstein gave money to. And Andrew Stein went down in like flames, but basically she was married to Andrew Stein, then they got divorced. And then she owned Ghislaine Maxwell's 116 East 65th Street townhome and sold it for like undervalue to Epstein's lawyer, who's on the paperwork, because it's not really him, he's handling it. And then the house became Maxwell's and she sold it. But Forrester is now Lady de Rothschild. Lady de Rothschild,
I
Lady
think you're right.
Rothschild, I think, something like that. And she's married to a member of that family in the UK.
Follow-up comment here about Todd Meister married Nikki Hilton for 6 weeks after
Wow.
knowing each other for just 3 months. I had a question about Mark Epstein's children. Do you know anything about them?
I know he had a woman. I don't know if they actually got married, but she was living in 301 East 66th Street, that big building that Mark actually owns. It used to be that building was once owned by Wexner. See, that's one of those patterns of like Wexner property now is Epstein property, but that particular one was most of the units. I think he owns the building and a lot of the units, but other people own some of the apartments. And I see, yeah, there you are. Yeah, if you go out there, there's like a lot of Eastern European women, probably like Russian oligarchs, and fancy dining outside in the summer. You hear a lot of like Russian being spoken on that block when you go out there, and you see a lot of model-esque looking women. Um, at least I
Yeah.
did when I went out there, just on a random like afternoon. I went out there and was like, wow, this is an interesting area. I'm not sure if that's the building. One of the buildings, either the one that Epstein lived in on 65th Street or this building, had a lot of like in the 50s or 60s, like a lot of like diplomats would live in one of the, I forget which building it was, right? So that's kind of interesting, right? A building with a bunch of diplomats. I mean, that's a freaking intelligence target right there.
And this is where Jean-Luc Brunel housed the models.
Yes.
Yeah, underage or otherwise.
And he would make them pay rent, I think.
Yeah, and they would split the rent, I think, Epstein and Brunel.
Yeah. They're very exploitive. It's like, not only is it like sex trafficking and sexually abusing these women who you're controlling in another country and they might not be familiar with the language, but there's also like, it's like you're taking their modeling earnings, like, and exploiting them like it is an indentured servant almost.
Yes, yeah, it seemed like they did do that. And if you had to pick which Epstein connection surprised you the most, or is there one in particular that you think is underlooked or not mentioned?
That's a good question, man. It's a really good question. It's almost like he tried to be connected to like everybody. I mean, I think the most bizarre one that like, but at the same time, it's like, was the Michael Jackson. One victim did allegedly see Michael Jackson sitting at in the kitchen of his Palm Beach mansion, and it's just like, oh, there's Michael Jackson. And that was an Epstein thing, to have like famous people just materialize at his house. Like he loved when people would run it because it would show how powerful and connected he was, and he wanted people to know that. But like he didn't want to advertise it, but he wanted people to know. But that was really weird. Like, why Michael Jackson? And I tried to see if Michael Jackson ever had any, if I could ever find. I went through a bunch of Michael Jackson's like legal paperwork, and I could never find any like if he was giving him tax advice or something. But I do know that one of Epstein's old friends bought Neverland, Tom Barrack, who's now under like federal indictment. He might be in jail.
Oh, Thomas Barrack, Colony Capital, right?
Yes.
Yes. Also connected to Maxwell, I believe.
Probably.
It was Epstein or Maxwell. I can't remember. Or
yeah, actually, it goes back to Towers. Barrack
Yeah.
was going to buy Towers for $200 million, allegedly. I don't know if it was just a press release or if it was true. But yeah, Barrack is a guy. He was basically operating as a foreign agent without registering, like kind of lobbying on behalf of the Saudi government in the U.S. Because if you're going to come in and start lobbying our government, you have to register and tell them that's what you're doing.
Yeah, and his case is ongoing, I think.
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah,
Yeah.
UAE lobbyist Thomas Barrack and Matthew Grimes. Okay, so they're Eastern District of New York. And they were arraigned July of last year.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's ongoing. Because I recall reading about that in Sean Atwood's book on who killed Epstein.
Right. Oh, another one was weird. Like, one of his friend, and I think his friend, he might be mistaken, but he was trying to tell me that like Kurt Cobain's estate, that like Epstein, because Courtney Love is, her name is in the black book and it's circled.
Yeah.
So like one of his friends said it was his understanding that Jeffrey may have helped with their estate, of like Kurt Cobain's estate. I couldn't find any evidence, but I ended up reading, a rabbit hole. I ended up reading a really long lawsuit about some guy who married Kurt Cobain's daughter and stole a guitar or something. It was kind of interesting. I don't know if he stole the guitar, or if he got the guitar as a gift, and then like allegedly Courtney Love sent henchmen out to get the guitar back and beat him up or something. I don't know. It was just like another rabbit hole of interesting stories, but I don't know what the Epstein. It is kind of weird though. I guess like Prince Andrew showed up at Courtney Love's house one night, wanting to hang out with her or something, and she had some kind of teacup with the picture of the Queen of England on it, and just thought it was funny that he'd show up there in the middle of the night. But the butler that stole Epstein's black book, I mean, he printed out from the computer, he would
Yeah.
circle names, meaning that investigators should interview these people because they know something about Epstein's illegal activities with minors. I don't know why he circled Courtney Love, and I don't think, it's something that, you want to have to go explaining to people. It might have been a mistake. Maybe the butler mistook somebody for Courtney Love, though. Not sure.
Very interesting. Very interesting because he's no longer around. He's dead. Alfredo Rodriguez, who got in trouble for attempting to sell that black book to lawyers. Do you think Ghislaine Maxwell was ever molested or sexually abused as a child?
I think it's a possibility. I've not seen any direct evidence. Somebody I was speaking with the other day when you were there. I think her name was Nadia, and she was saying that it was her belief that like maybe she was like the victim of like incest molestation by the father, but
she was his favorite child, so
yeah,
perhaps there's something to it. But I just wanted to see what your take was.
His favorite thing in the world was his yacht, and he named his yacht after her. Unless maybe he just liked the name, I don't know. It's possible because she, where do you learn to do this? This type of stuff, and like where did like Maxwell learn to like recruit girls? Is it just be charming like I always am and I can convince them? And was it that like Epstein said you need to find girls for me, or was it like did Ghislaine say, hey Jeffrey, you should try younger girls? I can't keep up with you. I mean, we don't know. Like, what was the dynamic? How did this launch? Was Epstein always interested in underage girls? Is it something that like developed? Because he was dating like models and he had all kinds of beautiful, famous women that would somehow hang out with him in the 80s, even. Like he had the woman from Dallas, I think like Maria said she went to Epstein's office one time and she's like, is that the woman from Dallas? And she was just standing behind Epstein like a statue, wouldn't even say a word. And it was that actress that played on Dallas, the TV show from the 70s and 80s. So he's got like, famous celebrities that like hang out with him. Former Miss Sweden is his like alleged long-term, it's Eva Anderson throughout the 80s. That's his girlfriend. And I think the butler did testify, though it wasn't until like Maxwell started hanging out with him. That's when the underage or the young masseuses, as they called them as a cover, started showing up in the Palm Beach residence. So I don't know. His favorite book was Lolita, which is by, the Russian writer that, Nabokov. I can't remember his name. So anyway, it's a literary classic in the United States, and it's basically a story of a grown man going after a teenager, and like that he's upset, like he can't help himself. And it's like, yeah, it can be written really nice, and the Russian writer was really good with the English language, I suppose. But why is this story like so lauded after? And I think that Epstein said that he kept a copy of the book on his aircraft and in his bedroom, and he contacted Edward J. Epstein, who used to work for Nabokov as a graduate student at Cornell, and he would ask Edward J. Epstein. He's not related to Jeffrey Epstein, but he's like a political scientist and an investigative journalist. But Epstein, he actually wrote a profile of Epstein in 1989. And there's no mentions of like Epstein being a spy or anything. It's just Epstein's like this insider trader who does it legally type of thing. But anyway, Epstein would grill him about like what was Nabokov like, and I think there's this phenomenon of pedophiles want to find famous pedophiles or like big important figures in history who were also child molesters or pedophiles, so that they can like identify with them and show that like that they're actually, what I'm doing is, it's normal. And Epstein was one of those people that and Epstein, arguably Jeffrey Epstein's attorney, Alan Dershowitz, who's written an argument that the age of consent should be lowered. I know in '97 in the LA Times, that was a year after he met Epstein. He wrote that. Have you ever read that op-ed?
I have, yeah. He wants it lowered to 15, or he wrote, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses this argument in the op-ed that's identical to this like French pedophile society was using in the late 70s when like Roman Polanski fled to France, and all these like big French intellectuals signed this letter that these two men who were molesting boys and girls that were in jail, that they should be released because children should have sexual freedom. And it gets really creepy around that, because it's like you're trying to make this legal argument to legalize child molesters. And this was a big thing in the late 70s and early 80s. In the early 80s in the United States, this group called NAMBLA, which was really a sex ring for, it was called like the National North American Man-Boy Lovers Association. And there was these men that would, have you ever heard of NAMBLA?
I think it rings a bell.
Yeah, I mean, why would you want to hear of it? But yeah, it was a like a pedophile advocacy group that they were trying to change the law. But I think like most of the members wound up in investigations, and this is when like the FBI, to their credit, was taking a lot of this stuff seriously in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was no longer, because I guess the preconceived notion was that, okay, people who molest children are men in trench coats who hang out at playgrounds with candy, and they go and they trick the child and then they molest them. But that's reality,
usually the story,
yeah, that was the story. But the FBI agents, and there was this woman, she's a psychiatric nursing professor, Ann Burgess. She created this she was like her and this guy Ken Lanning, who was an FBI instructor, they changed this whole behavioral science unit of the FBI was changed by them, and they showed that all the investigations, all the evidence show that it's actually grooming by usually sometimes it's one person by themselves, and other times it's a ring of usually men who groom victims and target them and then go after them. And it's usually leaders of the community, wealthy people. They found there was a guy in Long Island just like Jeffrey Epstein in the 1950s. That was one of the other surprising things I found. I think I've lost your sound.
Pardon me, Professor. Could you repeat that, what you just said?
Sure. One of the surprising things I came across was that in the 1950s, there was a man kind of like Jeffrey Epstein, except this guy actually was a scientist. He didn't just read science books like Epstein. In Long Island, he was this really wealthy, what they called a white Russian, who was sort of like a non-communist Russian who left Russia because of the communists.
Royalist.
What's that?
Like one of the Russian royalists, right?
Yeah, somebody who'd be more aligned with like the Tsar and stuff.
Yeah.
So he came to the U.S. and he was an engineer. And he designed, I think, like, if you know, like drones that we get with the like 4 propellers, like those little drone, like my kid has one. You can put
They're
a
pretty
camera
expensive,
on it.
actually.
Yeah, we got it off Amazon for $80.
Nice.
It's kind of hard to fly, but it's kind of fun. But anyway, it's like a quadra rotor. Well, this Russian guy invented these helicopters, because the Russians are, if you'll look today, Russian military has a lot of helicopters, right? Because helicopters is something that like the Russians, I think, had, I don't know if they, I would say invented, but they pioneered like the modern helicopter. There was a lot of design there. So this Russian guy started working for the U.S. military as a defense contractor in the 20s and 30s, and he developed all these like weapons, and not just weapons and helicopters, and but one of the key things was recording equipment. Like he invented the camera that filmed, I think, like one of the major nuclear bomb tests. That is like the picture of the atom bomb going off in the mushroom cloud. Well, he invented some camera that could withstand like the effects of the blast and take that picture. So this guy was loaded. He was just like he has a ton of patents. He invented all this stuff. He was really rich, and he had like been married to a much younger woman in Palm Beach. And then in the 1950s, he was in his 60s, and he had this mansion it was in Long Island, and then he owned like the farmers market in Massapequa, and he had this really lavish apartment above the farmers market, which caught on fire one night. So the thing caught on fire. This guy shows up in his Cadillac, and there's all these like weird film canisters. The firefighters are like, they're putting out the fire, and there's like film canisters falling out. And he's like, "Oh, I do top secret work for the government. I'll pay you $400 or $500 if whichever firefighter rounds up all the film canisters and finds them in the smoldering, whatever, because I guess the film could, withstand the fire." And so the cops were there, and like, how come he didn't come to us? How come he's going to the firemen and he's not talking to us? So they got suspicious, like, whoa, 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 bring us the film canisters. So they do, and it's they're like looking at him, and they're like, this doesn't look like top secret military. What is this? Let's take this to like a film projector. So I guess like some of it was so anyway, they put it all together, and it's film of him having sex with teenage girls. This Russian inventor in the 50s.
Wow.
That lived in America, and he was worth like $250 million in today's money. And so they arrest him. He gets arrested. It turns out that he was recruiting like girls at the farmers market. He would come out with like jewelry, or he would offer them, much like Maxwell did, secretary jobs. Oh, do you want a job as a secretary? And they were like, working class girls from Long Island, and they would, would love to have a piece of jewelry. Or, oh, come upstairs, I'll show you. I got more jewelry like this upstairs. He's an older man. This guy used to wrestle. He had a pet bear at his mansion, like a pet bear. He would wrestle the bear. It's like an old Russian tradition, like bear wrestling. And I guess he had lost a finger doing it one time. But anyway, so they arrest him, and it's like parents want to kill this guy, and like he just stays in jail for like a month, and then he finally gets bail, and he leaves the country. And pretty much everything he did was very similar to Jeffrey Epstein. Right down like bribing law enforcement, buying a house. They think he bought a house in Mexico and fled to Mexico, but nobody knows for sure where he went. Ultimate flight risk.
So he kind of disappeared into the abyss?
Yep. He got bail, and he fled the country, which is what Epstein would have done. That's exactly what, and probably what Maxwell would do if she was granted bail. Because she's got, she's got passports in multiple countries, friends all over the world. She's out of here.
Sure.
I mean, that's what.
And what was his name again? That scientist?
Ivan Emarev. It's like this. I think like I believe he changed his name. He had like a really Russian sounding name, and then he changed his name to Ivan Jerome, Jerome, Ivan Jerome, and he lived in Long Island, and
wow,
he was just like Epstein. He was filming the activities. Now that's actually like a behavioral characteristic of pedophiles, is that they often take pictures and video of their victims as they in the act or before the act or both, and then they have all kinds of uses. They can sell it. A lot of times they're like they keep it, and pedophiles will amass their child porn collection. It's like a member of their family. You can read about this in the FBI manual, that they're like so attached to their collection, as they call it, that like some of them, they'll get arrested, and they'll learn that like the government's going to destroy their collection, and they'll try to give instructions to the government as if they're burying a loved one. It's insane. So what happened in the 1950s, there were no there were no cell phones, obviously, and video cameras didn't exist. So this guy actually used his technical know-how from working for the Defense Department to set up like all these like pulleys and levers and foot pedals in his mansions, because they found it in everywhere he lived. They found like stashes of these films, and he would film as he was molesting a victim. And this was in the 1950s. 1955 was when he got arrested. But this is like, like that island we were talking about in Lake Michigan, North Fox Island, the same thing. So pedophiles, sometimes they just collect their child pornography that they create of their victims for themselves. And then sometimes they do it for commercial purposes or both. Like they trade it with other pedophiles. And then sometimes they use it to shop their victims to other child molesters. It's pretty sick stuff. Like when you start to learn about like these people and like the way that they operate, and because usually like when the government finds child porn, it's usually a pathway to finding victims and finding a ring of like people behind it.
Yeah,
it's cruel and heartless. I mean, just the way they treat the victims.
Question here:
Mhm.
What was the aviation company in New York? Was it Republic? Was he with Republic? Russian aviation engineer?
I don't think he had I don't remember the name of his company. I know he had like a shell company to do his business, which was, I think it was like to some extent like legitimate stuff, which was like, I think it was like the original thing. He has like a patent or a design for like this massive helicopter that could pick up like a couple of tanks and move them. Because I guess that was the idea at the time, was to have a helicopter that could like pick up a tank and then move it into the section of the war zone. But I don't remember I don't know if it was called Russian aviation. I don't know for sure. I could go back and see what we have on the guy.
Another comment here. James Wood tweeted his disgust for them being the NAMBLA group.
Ooh.
Kitty Diddlers. JA was asking about that. Carmen Smith-Studer believes that Ghislaine Maxwell was abused as a child. And the name Ghislaine means sacrifice in name meaning books. Also means pledge and hostage.
Whoa.
Another comment here from Wild Tangent. Someone who worked with Kurt, I think Kurt Cobain, on his last video, told me she thinks Courtney Love was involved with this particular ring group network. Trump also bought a used yacht off of Khashoggi, says Billy Boy, and named it after his daughter as well. So, oh yeah, and I didn't bring this up. Great point, Thomas. What happened to Brian Vickers' wife, Sarah Kellen, who worked with Epstein and Maxwell? Any thoughts on Sarah Kellen, Professor?
Yeah, well, she was sort of like the heir, or at least to the role that Maxwell played. So she sort of she was like, it's almost like Maxwell was training her to be her replacement for Epstein. And she was married. She like when Epstein went to jail. I know Sarah Kellen was dating like a wealthy Palm Beach, the son of a wealthy Palm Beach family for a while. I don't know how she got hooked up with the NASCAR driver, Brian Vickers, but she married him. But I do know that like Kellen has, she sued Epstein's estate under a pseudonym, claiming that Epstein continued to victimize her into like 2012, and that like he would come and like just show up in wherever she was sleeping, and he would demand like that he could have sex with her and do sexual stuff with her whenever he wanted. But I think like if you look at the evidence in like the Giuffre lawsuit, Kellen has quite a bit of liability here. Now, Kellen is named as a co-conspirator in Epstein's Florida non-prosecution agreement, so she would be at least legally off the hook for her actions in Florida. Now, if she recruited and trafficked people in other places like New York, but from what I know, I have heard that like the Southern District of New York isn't particularly interested in like going after Kellen. I mean, because like Kellen, like you'd think that like she'd be the ultimate like flip, right? You arrest her and flip her against Ghislaine
Yeah.
Maxwell in New York. Has to be New York. So it might be that maybe Kellen hasn't done enough provable stuff that they have evidence for in New York. In terms of like New Mexico, did Kellen recruit in New Mexico? Did she recruit in the Virgin Islands? I assume it's pretty clear that Kellen did some recruiting in Florida. I don't know how much she did in New York, but she would be the ultimate flip. Like you hit her with like, you're facing life in jail. Tell us everything about Ghislaine and flip her against Ghislaine. But that didn't happen.
What about Nadia Marchinkova, or Nadia Marchenko, as she changed her name to?
Yeah,
a similar role, right?
Yeah, notice how they like the fallout of Epstein caused these women to like legally change their names. I do know that Kellen changed Sarah Vickers. She went from Sarah Kellen to Sarah Kensington to Sarah Vickers, but I know she legally changed her name back to Kellen. I think it was in late 2020, and I don't know what the reasoning might have been behind that. But there was if you go to the Florida, I think it's like in Miami-Dade County in the probate records. What was the question? I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, I was just asking your thoughts on Marchenko or Marchenkova.
Oh, yeah. She's like, we don't know how much recruiting she did. We do know that she participated when she was probably not a minor in sexual acts with minors. She's, I think, largely seen as a victim. Epstein, we don't know if it's true, but Epstein bragged that he bought her from her family in Yugoslavia, and basically that she was his sex slave and that he just bought her from her family. Epstein said that, but you can't always take Epstein at his word, of course, but you never know. It might be true, it might not be true. He did, he's a pathological liar. He told people he studied math with the Unabomber. Which is like insane, because he'd have to have like when he was 16 living with his dad working at the Parks Department, he'd have to leave high school and go all the way out to California to do that, and that's probably not likely. Anyway, Marcinkova basically trained as a pilot while with Epstein. I do know that like when Epstein tried to intimidate, influence the Palm Beach investigation, and he showed up with Nadia Marcinkova at the police chief's office. I interviewed the police chief at the time in Palm Beach, and he said that Epstein showed up with her, and Epstein was carefully studying the guy's bookshelf. He's trying to figure out this police chief, trying to figure out, and I think he was trying to figure out his weakness. Epstein always went for your weakness.
He was literally studying his bookshelf.
Yep, he was trying to see what's his family like, what's he interested in based on the books that are on the bookshelf, what awards has he won. He said he was watching Epstein was studying the bookshelf and the wall, everything that was in his office. Epstein was carefully studying it as he was talking to him. And Epstein was there to ask if, did you get that $90,000 check I just donated to the Palm Beach police? Because Epstein wanted the investigation to go away, right? And he said, he thanked him for it. And this police Chief Ryder is just
Michael Ryder, right?
Yeah, Michael Ryder. If we all had him as our police chief, I mean, police departments would be run really well and professional. But that's what you get in Palm Beach. You get the police department that really serves the people that live there. It has a lot of money, but maybe everybody could have that someday. So he said, on the way out, he walked Epstein out, and he thanked him for the check, and he was on guard because he knew Epstein's under investigation. Detective Ricari's handling that investigation, and he was watching the investigation very carefully because this is a wealthy Palm Beacher, knows all these presidents and has flown them on his plane. It's something that could blow up, right? So you got to be careful that the investigation is being done properly. And then Ryder is just we have to protect these victims. These are girls that live in a town, in a county where I'm the police chief. I have to make sure we're doing everything that we're supposed to make sure that, we have a solid investigation and we can bring charges against him. And the police chief's not an idiot. He knows Epstein's going to have the best lawyers in the country, so they have to do everything perfect by the book. Which I think they pretty much, that's a model investigation. Because they're sloppy investigations, and if they were sloppy, Epstein would have a lot of cause to get away with stuff. But like he said, when he was walking him out, Marcinkova was following Epstein with her head down, and they got back on their bicycles and they rode back to Epstein's house. I mean, I guess that's where they rode. That's where he thinks they rode. Yeah.
That was after a court date?
No, this was just before the Epstein was even. This is when Epstein knew he was under investigation.
Oh, where were they exiting though? Where were they leaving from to
The
go
police
to that
department.
house? Oh, okay.
Yeah, this
Gotcha.
was like in early 2005, or I'm not sorry,
Gotcha.
it might have been early 2006 because Epstein figured out he was under investigation in October of 2005. So Epstein didn't know for like 6 months. I think it was like the investigation started in March, right? So 10, maybe 7 months until Epstein, and he found out by accident. He found out because a victim said, the police just came to my house asking about Jeffrey. Is there like anything I have to worry about? She called up Sarah Kellen. So Sarah Kellen told Epstein, and that's how Epstein figured out he was under investigation.
What do you think about Detective Joseph Recarey's death?
I remember when I started getting heavy into this project, I was going to reach out, and then I was Googling. I'm like, oh my God, he passed away. And the conspiracy type thinking, oh my God, did they off him? Did Epstein have this man killed? But I believe he died of cancer. I don't know if he was, I think he might have been, a stressed out guy who smoked a lot. I'm not completely sure. I don't know his health history, but I didn't want to, I figure like his wife is probably grieving. He doesn't need some guy working on a book calling her up. So I just kind of, maybe someday I'll ask her. I think she may have been interviewed. I know it would have made him very happy to see Epstein arrested. I know that.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to ask because it did seem interesting timing. Do you anticipate any other arrests happening as far as the Epstein Maxwell network goes, whether this year or next?
I mean, it was good that Brunel got arrested, but he committed suicide apparently in prison, unless somebody actually got in there and killed him. I don't know. Yeah. So you got Maxwell, you got Epstein, you got Brunel. 2 are dead, 1's alive. I mean, legally, Kellen would be a no-brainer because of the evidence. I mean, you can see the evidence in the civil case of Kellen's name is on everything. They have her phone records. Her phone, like she's calling victims all day in her phone records. They're part of the state attorney file release. You can look at it like, hundreds of pages of her phone records. Training, doing a little bit of training as to the massage, participating in some of the group sexual activities. Yeah, she's there. I'm not 100% sure how many. I think a lot of it could depend on like victims and what evidence they have. Like, do you have pictures or maybe there's a video of like a CEO at Epstein's house doing something. Now, I'm not 100% sure because I think like, with Epstein was definitely into minors. How many of Epstein's friends were into minors? I'm pretty sure Epstein had women sleeping with people who may have been like in their early 20s. I'm pretty sure. And then there's a lot of women that were in Epstein's orbit that later married rich men. So it's almost, I've speculated that maybe he was running like a wealthy matchmaker service too, for like, wealthy idiots, it's just kind of like weird rich men who like need like a woman who's very subservient because they can't attract another rich woman who's maybe a little more assertive, and maybe Epstein had a solution, and Epstein I would presume would handle their prenuptial agreement. And Epstein had these weird ideas about like he would advise clients to like, instead of a prenuptial agreement where like you get the money the minute you're married, or you get a small amount of money so that like it protects his client from like losing half their fortune should there be a divorce.
He did date Eva Dubin before she married Glenn Dubin, or Eva Anderson as she was known.
Right. So Epstein likely may have made that introduction. I don't know if she met Glenn Dubin on her own. Glenn Dubin was sort of like a ladies' man in the 80s. Like he was this hotshot Wall Street guy, had a lot of girlfriends. I think he was married to somebody else before her. So I don't know if like if Epstein made their introduction. I don't know. There's a few people of women that that there's a couple that were minors when they were with Epstein and Epstein was molesting them. And then when they were above 18, like they were dating like Donald Trump. There was a couple women.
Really? Do you know
Yeah.
their names?
One of them was in the trial. One of them was one of the victims at the trial.
Who was that?
The third victim.
Was that the blonde one, Kate?
Yeah.
Or was that Caroline?
I forget their pseudonyms, but it was the one from overseas, from England.
Yeah, that was the blonde one. I think she went by Kate.
Yeah, she was with
dated Trump
for a little while. Yeah.
Really? Wow. Do you remember? Because I can't remember her real name off the top of my head.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to be respectful of her testifying under a pseudonym. So I guess with the Google sleuthing, you can figure it out.
Okay. I'll look it up later. No worries. And I wanted to ask too about sentencing, which is the 25th of June. Hopefully, I'll see you there, Professor. What do you anticipate? Do you see a mistrial happening?
It really hinges on this judge and what the judge thinks. I believe I do know that like jury convictions in a federal trial are considered like sacrosanct, and there has to be like a really good reason to overturn a jury verdict. Now Scotty, the juror, I mean, it's plausible what he says, right? That like, there's like, I think there was like 600 potential jurors, right? Fill out this questionnaire. Okay. Take the questionnaire home, fill it out. He says he was going through a breakup with a partner. Maybe he was just, let me just get this over with. I'll never, I'm not going to get picked. There's 600 people, the likelihood of getting picked is a little low. Okay. And so like, maybe he flew through it and, he went in. He wasn't trying. It sounds like he was in with the situation of like, I don't really want to be on a jury because it's it's a lot of work. It's a big commitment, and you lose time at work and stuff and lose money. But he wound up on the jury, and like as he's filling out the questionnaire, it's one of those things like, do you really want to think about the time you were molested? When you're filling out this big questionnaire, and maybe you think of like, oh, I was molested as a child, and the questionnaire says, were you sexually abused? And maybe you don't put the two pieces of length. I don't know what was going through his mind. I'm sure he was probably trying to rush through the questionnaire and just kind of get it over with. I mean, last time I got picked for jury duty, I was glad I was sent home. I was like, oh, what's this going to entail? But at the same time, if it was, if I got picked, I'd be like, okay, I got to take this seriously. This is what we're supposed to do. So he wasn't like willfully trying to get on the jury. Like he doesn't indicated that he was trying to get on the jury, high profile case, so that he could like, go and convict her. He wasn't indicative of that. But at the same time, he did lie. He had multiple opportunities to kind of come forward with this idea that this did happen to him. But there's all kinds of reasons people don't like to think about this, because it's usually like one of the worst things that happened to you in your life is to get like molested, depending on how it was and how bad, how much you remember, if you've had therapy. And it's not something that you really like to sit around and think about and talk about with people. It's traumatic. So
Right.
Maybe as he watched the trial and thought about memory, you're supposed to bring your own life experience into the jury room, which he did, and he did get molested. And he thought, I can't remember everything, but I remember the basics of what happened to me, and convince the other jurors that maybe that's like how our memories work.
Gotta wrap up here, unfortunately, Professor Volscho, but this has been an amazing show. One last question here, J.A. Thomas, did you ever hear about Epstein and Maxwell killing sex trafficked victims? It's been said that they threw young girls off the Lolita Express when they fought back being forced to have sex on the jet. Anything like that? And then closing thoughts, and where can people support and find your work?
I think I've heard people say things like that, but I've never seen any like solid evidence that they did that. I think that would be a legal nightmare. It's easier to just say she's lying than to kill somebody. for fighting back. I think when victims fought back, I know like Haley Ropes and Epstein saw this girl's strong. Why don't you recruit people for me? I'm not going to molest you. She's a bit of a, daughter of a cop, whatever, a little stronger and assertive person. But like when Epstein had victims trapped at his island, I know Sarah Ransom was thinking about diving into the shark-infested waters to get off that island. I mean, she was willing to risk her life to get out of there. They would confiscate passports. I think they used a lot more psychological manipulation. And
Yeah.
to what extent Epstein ever used force on his victims, I think, there's a couple of cases where it was forceful, but most of the time it wasn't. It was psychological manipulation.
Okay. Excellent. And then where can people find you, Professor, and if they want to follow and support your work? You're on Twitter, correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I have a Twitter page, and I'm actively finishing the book. It's under review at a press. It's under peer review, so like other criminologists are going to read it and make sure that like my research is up to snuff, and then give it the okay or not give it the okay. And then I have to move on to another press. But it's like I'm actively still writing some of the very substantive chapters, but I have quite a few chapters ready for the publisher. So I just have to wait till the book comes out. But you can follow me on Twitter. Sometimes I'm active on it, and sometimes I'm not because I'm too busy doing like other things like teaching or research. And
okay,
but yeah, pretty much my Twitter account.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Volscho. I'm really hoping we can do this again. It's really been a fantastic interview. People can access this video-wise on rockfin.com/addiads, ROKFIN.com. And audio will be available anywhere podcasts can be found. Twitter is @addiads, one spelled out. Personal website is addiads.one, one spelled out. And Patreon as well, patreon.com/addiads. But prefer buy me a coffee if anybody wants to support. Stay frosty, folks, and we'll see everybody next time.